Welcome back, everyone, to what I have chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Now, because of the nature of this movie, it's going to be a really fun variety episode. I've got a handful of different bands I wanted to zero in on, and because they interest me, or there's something about this era of their career that I could research and find some good stories about. But also the different stories in the movie and the different kinds of animation I think are really interesting, and it speaks to the place in the history of animated features that this movie occupies. I was quite the little animation enthusiast and cartoon and comic strip enthusiast as a kid. I used to draw a lot, used to do the wacky voices that I could mimic from cartoons and stuff. And I would pay attention to who the voice actors were on the things that I liked, who were the different puppeteers who voiced the different Muppets. And, why is it I could tell, this guy doing the voice of Max Sterling on Robotech, the Macross saga, sounds suspiciously like Leonardo from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And then I would become a teenager and hear the same voice in the movie Akira. I'd keep track of that stuff and remember these names of these performers. A little bit dorkier and about that kind of thing than I think most kids my age. And I didn't see heavy metal until well into my 30s. But in the era when it came out, of course, because I was a little kid, I saw tons of fantasy films in my elementary school days, like The Last Unicorn, the Rankin Bass Hobbit adaptation, the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings adaptation. Boy, that was hard on the eyes. I own it on DVD now, but that's hard to get a kid to sit down and stare at all that dark, grainy stuff for whatever that 2 hours is. And combine that with Japanese sci-fi animated shows like Star Blazers and Robotech that were on in the early 80s when I was a kid. Those things got into my brain before the big 80s explosion of action figure-oriented cartoons that, of course, I was the right age to sort of lap up as well. Mostly Transformers, though. Gotta say, to me, that one was the best. And then the movie came out and just killed all the momentum by murdering all your favorite characters. Did make me a huge Orson Welles fan. I didn't know it at the time, but eventually on rewatch, I would become enthralled with the voice acting of Orson Welles. So we've established I liked the animation style in the feature films that I saw in this era. What I've never taken too much of a likingness to is a lot of the hard rock and heavy metal of this era. And I'll get deeper into that later when I'm discussing the individual artists on the soundtrack. But let me just say that I never could dig, I can't really dig this era where the guitar tones kind of go to this type of a sound. I do not like all that chorus pedal stuff in hard rock. Leave it to the police, please. Let the clean guitar guys do it. Especially because I really adore the era before this in hard rock where guitars sound more like this. Talking about classic hard rock era of your mid-60s, let's say, And then they were about to become something after this period that sounds like this, which I really loved. I mean, loved when I first heard it in the 90s, though it's an 80s sound. I wasn't into like heavy metal when I was a little kid. Yeah, so you get the idea. Doing an early 80s Metallica ripoff, and very poorly. But those are sort of like the before tones I like and the after tones I like, but we're still also in this era where there's rock guitar bands or hard rock bands or arena bands that are combining the, Marshall Stack crunchy guitar sound of the day with all their extra reverb and their extra processing and the chorus pedal noise and stuff, and synth players in the band. And I can never really get too into that stuff. You know, I can't get down with this kind of a tone in a hard rock song. Because they do these unisons that drive me crazy. I don't love that in my hard rock songs at all. So I'm not a real big... I'm not the target market for your Blue Oyster Cult type stuff, among other bands around the time. Love me some Deep Purple instead. You know, the previous era of combining guitars and keyboard players, or, you know, something funky. Of course, I love that stuff. I love me some, you know, love me some Parliament, and love me some Stevie Wonder and all kinds of great stuff with, you know, guitars and bass and your organ playing or your clavinet playing or your, you know, Wurlitzer kind of stuff. All right, so I've given you all my biases up front. That's what I do whenever I remember to. Every episode. That's what I do. So you know where I'm coming from and when not to trust me, perhaps, and when it comes to my opinion on things. Now here's me playing guitar with a chorus pedal on. Evidently my hypocrisy knows no bounds. Soundtrack, beginning to end, it's quite a variety of stuff, and it's quite a snapshot of hard rock music at the time in America, I would say, especially when you have like Devo in there being super weird and doing an old-timey song from the swing era. Is Lee Dorsey, I believe. I assume he was one of the Dorsey brothers with Tommy, that my grandparents used to listen to. And you've got, you know, you got a band called Riggs, has 2 songs. To me, they're a lot of the stuff that I don't like about heavy metal from this time. Same with the Sammy Hagar song, Heavy Metal. Same with the heavy metal song by Don Felder. I mean, it's not a heavy metal song, but it's kind of a hard rock song. It's all very, to me, it's all very middle of the road. You know, it's not as exciting to me as earlier hard rock in the 70s, and it's not as interesting and aggressive and progressive as metal was about to get pretty soon after this. So if that was your deal back then, I get it, but I don't see a lot of young people. I mean, my age, I'm 45, but I mean, younger than me, kind of championing this era of metal. It's usually something a little bit more obscure, if it is from this era, or maybe some European power metal stuff or what have you. The Grand Funk, always love me some Grand Funk, but this song is kind of bland. It's obviously later Grand Funk, more produced, more. Yeah, I was never super into really happy, bouncy Grand Funk. I gotta say, I like their hard rock stuff with a little fuzzier kind of low end going on, a little harder drumming. We'll get to talking about the other artists on here in depth that I felt like talking about and sort of digging into, those being Blue Oyster Cult, Stevie Nicks, Devo, the Dio era Black Sabbath, and a little bit of Cheap Trick. I got to admit, I'm saving Cheap Trick for a Rock and Rule episode where I'll combine a bit of a dive on them with some background on Blondie. But holy smokes, the 2 Cheap Trick songs on this are fantastic. I knew Cheap Trick growing up because of the Top Gun soundtrack, which is probably the worst way you could be introduced to Cheap Trick. And as I got older, of course, I heard Surrender and I Want You to Want Me. Those are both perfect songs and they're amazing. And I started to get a feel for how clever the songwriting was by Rick Nielsen musically, as well as the lyrics being really clever and wild as well. But there's a lot of movement going on in some of the best Cheap Trick songs. There's a lot of surprises, and even on these two, there's interesting changes and shifts in the style, the tempo, and the chord progressions and stuff, and what they do harmonically, and the delivery, of the vocals is so right up in your face and aggressive. I didn't really expect that. It's kind of cool to hear this kind of range from, someone like Robin Zander, who I always, I guess, undeservingly had a reputation in my head for being a pretty light, mellow, pleasant sort of delivery when it came to his rock and roll songs. Nope, he's a screamer. And you see that in the rock and roll tracks as well, that are being acted out on a stage by a really obnoxious main character who, is not terribly sympathetic either. So that lends a little bit more edge to it, I think, on those tunes. Now, I did find out through Mr. Christopher Todd Davis, who let me borrow a book, and from a message from him, that these are the only two songs Cheap Trick did with this one particular bass player who was sort of the interim guy after their main bassist of the classic era of Cheap Trick had left. And I think he went off to do a little music project with his wife. Don't know if he did a lot after that, but if he's making money off of the royalties from the previous catalog, he's probably doing A-okay. Christopher let me borrow this book. Reputation is a Fragile Thing, the story of Cheap Trick by Mike Hayes and Ken Sharp. Ken Sharp, one of the co-authors of Kiss, Behind the Mask, one of the best rock and roll books I've ever purchased and read. Ken Sharp is also the author or co-author of a book about the history of the making of John and Yoko's Double Fantasy. So there's a lot of connections there. And because you might not know this, I didn't know this until this week, Cheap Trick was the backing band for some of the recording of Double Fantasy with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Let's get into the pages of this book about Cheap Trick here. Skip the first chunk of the setup of the chapter. Bunny Carlos is getting married. Abandoning thoughts of reinstating George Martin in the producer's chair, Cheap Trick met with Roy Thomas Baker, renowned for his work with The Cars, Foreigner, and Queen. Initially, plans were limited to another soundtrack project based on the adult sci-fi fantasy comic Heavy Metal. Roy Thomas Baker explained how the liaison came about. Queen were saying, "We were out with Cheap Trick. They're great. You've got to work with these guys." And the same thing happened with the guys from The Cars. We met a couple of times. Then we met through Pete Comita. He was my wife's lover. Whether or not there was any truth to the allegation, Roy Thomas Baker produced 2 songs for the band, Nielsen's I Must Be Dreamin' and Reach Out. That was written by Bob James, who used to be with Ronnie Montrose's band. And Pete, revealed Rick, the people that did Heavy Metal wanted that song. It was sort of ironic that they wanted us to do it, not realizing that Pete was involved with the group. I thought the lyrics were great on that. We've been, and you've been, up against unbelievable odds in your social areas with your parents, and you can't just give up and be complacent about everything. Nobody owes you a living in this world, so go out and work for it. Reach Out originated with the band Empire, a group which featured both Comita and James back in the late 70s. The song showcased a strong melody and a tasteful use of keyboards. And I guess Pete Comita only recorded these 2 songs with Cheap Trick. He was out doing something else after this, and they moved on with another feller on the bass, if I'm not mistaken. The book goes on to say, I Must Be Dreamin', by contrast, was written to order by Nielsen. It was characterized by Xander's raucous, gonna raise hell vocal stylings and thunderous bass from Comita. Years later, the frantic drum guitar section was played on tape prior to the band's live shows. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that intro and outro to that song are nuts. Like, it's this really heavy, choppy, helicopter-y sound. It sounds like a programmed, like, double kick kind of pattern or something. I don't know. It could be all organic. It could have been played, live in studio and recorded that way. I have no idea. It's a swirling mishmash with the flange going on and this crazy kind of claustrophobic vibe to it. And then it kicks into the main riff, which is also sort of mirrored by the lead vocal of the verses. And if you remember that annoying song Paralyzer by Finger 11 back in 2007, this sounds like somebody just lifted the idea for that melody and that rhythm straight from this Cheap Trick tune. Not so much that I think they'd have a case in court, but, you know, I think someone's manager or producer might have been listening to that going, you know what, somebody should make a hit out of this today. And then they all got paid, and we had to hear that song for 2 years straight on all rock and pop stations in America. Thanks, music industry. Glad you were stomping down everything else in favor of that song. Like, we just gotten over 3 years of listening to Franz Ferdinand nonstop, and then you transition us into that. Like, how come there isn't an angry nu metal song about wanting to ask a girl to dance? Well, now there is. Here you go, everyone. It says in the book, Heavy Metal premiered on July 29 at the Ziegfeld Theater in New York and was a commercial disaster. However, the soundtrack album was strong, boasting high-quality contributions from acts like Black Sabbath, Nazareth, Oyster Cult, in addition to the brace of Trick tunes. Columbia Pictures even flew in the band to perform these two songs for 600 movie industry dignitaries and members of the press at Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum. Ties with Baker were subsequently maintained. As Rick confirmed, we did 2 songs for the heavy metal soundtrack, and that went well. And we decided whenever he had the time and we had the time, we'd like to make a record together. I did mention the band Nazareth. Yes, they're on the soundtrack. Also not my thing. Cool band. Got some great riffs. I don't have much to say about them is all. And the same thing for the most part with Trust. I listened to the tracks on here done by Trust, and it's this sort of midpoint between arena rock and heavy metal that would kind of come out of the early 80s that I kind of dig more. A very standard heavy rock guitar sound with a little chorus on there, play it through some Marshall Stacks, and a vocalist I don't really dig, but Trust is a really influential band for bands that I do like a lot. I remember the interview footage on an Anthrax DVD I have from 2004, I think. They talked about how when Charlie tried out on the drums, Scotty and I don't know if Danny was in the band at that time or not, but Dan Lilker was in the band, and they found out he liked Trust, this French band. And they were like, "Oh my God, you know how to play songs by Trust?" And Charlie was like, "Oh God, don't make me play Fast as a Shark. Please don't make me play Fast as a Shark. It's so tiring." And they're like, "Can you?" And he goes, "Yeah." So that was like the pinnacle of like double kick heavy metal drumming was the guy from Trust back in the late 70s, early 80s. And of course, Anthrax would have a big hit with a cover of Trust's Antisocial, which made me almost pee my pants in a movie theater when I was watching the Andy Machete It Part 1. And they have the big apocalyptic rock fight down by the creek, and they start hucking rocks at the bullies, and the Antisocial starts playing. And one of the bullies is wearing an Anthrax shirt, which is great. But I could definitely see how, that band was a huge influence on tons of other metal bands. And for the time, they were pretty amazing at what they did. I could also see Robin Zander's voice having an effect on Joey Belladonna from Anthrax. I hear a lot of similarity there in the energy and the pure power of his melodies and the great pitch while being aggressive and, accusatorial. Is that the word in the delivery of some of the more, nastier sounding songs? Now, let me dig into the John and Yoko book a little bit, because this is sort of what the band was up to before doing the heavy metal stuff and before their bassist kind of took himself out of the picture for a while. It turns out he did come back after 7 years out, and he's been in the band the whole time since '87. There you go. They start. Let's see. There's actually quite a bit covering the Cheap Trick involvement in this book, starting over the making of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Double Fantasy. And one of the guys that played drums in the sessions was Andy Newmark, and he says the same process of chemistry that took place between our rhythm section and John and Jack, and I think he means Jack Douglas, the producer, could have happened with Cheap Trick. We were simply lucky because we were the first ones to go into the studio with John and Jack. We got in there for the first 2 weeks of recording. Then when the Cheap Trick sessions came along, it was probably quite an abrupt change from the way we played, which of course is why one would try other players in the first place. Different players, different feel, different vibe, etc. Maybe it was too much of a departure from what we had done for the bulk of the record, which we had already recorded before the Cheap Trick sessions took place. Who knows? Had Cheap Trick started the sessions and been working with John and Jack for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we guys came in for a day, it would have been just as abrupt of a change. Neither section is better or worse than the other, just different. I've been on both sides of that scenario many times. Sometimes I'm replacing some other cats, and sometimes others are replacing me. It comes with a job, and when you're recording a musician, no one takes it personally. I certainly don't. I remember we came back into work after the Cheap Trick sessions, and John said, the tracks went great, but we want to cut the songs with you guys as well, and then we'll pick. That's the way to do it. Cut as much as you can with as many different musicians as you can, and then pick what you like. So Rick Nielsen says, we made up riffs for both the songs I'm Losing You and I'm Moving On, and they were copied. And then drummer Bunny Carlos said, when the band later recut those songs for the album, they didn't clone our version, but they copied Rick's riffs on the songs, and they did our arrangement of Moving On, too. Jack told me we cut those songs, had the band play along with it a few times on headphones to try to get the same feel you guys had. When we heard that, we started laughing. We thought, those guys must want to kill us. We were thinking, boy, if somebody asked us to do that, we'd sure put our unhappy faces on. Jack Douglas, the producer, says, we played the Cheap Trick track in their headphones and they played along with it, and that's how I recorded it. I don't think Andy ever quite got the feel. Andy has his own feel, and you just can't copy Bun E. I kind of wish Cheap Trick played on the entire album. Cheap Trick with Lennon on I'm Losing You sounds like a hit record. It was so cool. Bunny Carlos says, after the sessions, we went to Japan and did 3 shows. We flew back home, and we flew back to New York to do one more song. That was probably going to be Nobody Told Me or Grow Old With Me. We got there, and they were setting up a mix for that song with the reggae guitar, which I guess was Borrowed Time. John went, I don't think I'm going to cut this last song. We've got more than enough stuff. He said, sorry, guys, but thanks for coming. So we went back to the airport and came back home. Jack told Robin Zander and Rick that he might want them to come back and do some harmonies, but that didn't happen. Assistant engineer John Smith says he loved the tracks, thought they were driving and hard. They achieved a harder sound than the rest of the record, which to some degree was their downfall. They simply didn't fit in with the other songs. Keyboard player on the tracks was George Small, and he says, even though as a curios, those are interesting versions of the songs, I guess it just didn't fit the concept of the album. Rick would say, they said our stuff sounded too rough. It wasn't compatible with the rest of the tunes. It sounded different. Bunny said, sonically, our versions didn't fit with the rest of the record. It would have been like an orange in the middle of a batch of apples. People would have went, what the hell is this? I thought the finished versions were real slick. I thought our versions were cooler. He also says, after the sessions, we went over to Japan. Word already reached them there that we were working with him. It was like the worst, best-kept secret in the world. When we did press in Japan, somebody said, I hear you're working with John Lennon. We said, yep, we worked with him, but we don't know what's going to happen. Jack Douglas says, from my perspective, those versions didn't make it because Yoko thought we were giving Cheap Trick a free ride. Who were they to be playing on this record? Jack Douglas's business partner, Stan Vincent, says, I don't believe Yoko realized how big Cheap Trick was at the time. They weren't riding on anyone's coattails. Douglas says, John liked that track so much, but it wasn't worth going up against Yoko for that one. She didn't realize they were established, and in fact, we're doing a record with George Martin at the time, which was the album All Shook Up. Bunny Carlos says, we heard that Yoko thought we were getting publicity on John's back, which struck us at the time as kind of ridiculous, because John hadn't had an album out in 5 years, and we had a top 5 album. We thought that was kind of goofy. Another layer to this, another sort of business tangential layer that's funny, is that Cheap Trick was on Epic Records at the time, which was owned by CBS. And Yoko had some paranoid fear that if Cheap Trick, being a CBS band, played on Double Fantasy, CBS would come and just claim the whole album. Like, it's a very silly concept. You could talk to a lawyer about that. You know, you could talk to somebody in the business about that. Or, you know, you could just be very paranoid and self-assured and, you know, make ill-informed decisions about things in the studio based on fear that is unsubstantiated. Though, a quote from Yoko her side of it is they didn't make it on the album because John didn't want it. John didn't think it was right for the album. He wanted to do it his way. One of the guys that worked on the record, Tony DeVillo, notes that after those two songs were done with Cheap Trick, one day he was walking in the control room and John has his feet up on the desk and he's reading Rolling Stone and all of a sudden goes, "God damn it, son of a bitch! Who let this info out to them? I didn't want the press to know anything about them being up here," because it said something about Cheap Trick being up at the Hit Factory working on John and Yoko's new album. And I guess that was the September 18th, 1980 issue of Rolling Stone. And it was just random notes section report on Lennon's new album featuring assistance from Cheap Trick. And then John takes his pen and just starts digging a big X across the paper, the text, in the article. Just quite shocking to people in the room. It was kind of a bummer and a come down from a high that everyone had from the sessions going so well. George Small, the keyboardist, says it was one of the few times that he saw John so angry, and I think that's why their tracks weren't used on the album. There's also a suggestion that they sounded too much like the song Cold Turkey, and he didn't want to do another, replicate that kind of vibe. Bunny Carlos says, the tracks never came out. Then in 96 or 97, we heard from Yoko that they wanted to use our version of I'm Losing You on the Lennon box set. It was neat that it was finally out there. I was proud of it when we did it and glad it still sounded good years later. For many years, we told people we did this thing with John Lennon and it never came out. You can imagine people thinking it mustn't have been that good if it didn't come out. Yoko asked us if we wanted to do a music video for it with Tony Levin, and we did it. Okay, I saw that. Yeah, I was plunking around on YouTube yesterday, and I saw it. I'm like, why is Tony Levin playing bass in Cheap Trick? That's weird. Okay. Now, I did take a second to flip into A Little Weird, How Kiss, Cheap Trick, Aerosmith, and Stars Remade Rock and Roll by Doug Broad. This is a book I've tried to use in the past for other episodes, or I kept taking notes from and meaning to use, because there's just so little published about Cheap Trick. And this one's not a good one to navigate for straight research, really, because the stories of all these bands intertwine a lot, and I don't even think there's an index. Oh, no, I tell a lie. There is an index, so I could probably, I could jump around a bit that way if I wanted to. But this chunk here relates directly to the era I'm talking about and the shuffling of bass players. So I'll sort of answer my own ambiguousness from earlier in this same recording this same afternoon. When Cheap Trick stepped on stage at the Winnipeg Arena in Manitoba, Canada on August 7, 1980, it probably took fans a few moments to realize something was amiss. The bass player was carrying the usual monster 12-string, but he looked just slightly off. The hair seemed about right. Big brown curls framed a jaw carved out of quartz, cascaded towards hard-angled shoulders. But where was that dimpled chin that you could park a bicycle in? Who was this imposter, and what had they done to Tom Peterson? The official line was that Peterson had fallen ill, having contracted an incapacitating viral infection that made his hands and teeth numb and caused him to vomit blood. He left for medical reasons, Rick Nielsen. He made us sick. Hey-oh. What went unsaid was the fact that for months, the bassist had been checking out of the band. Soon after, Peterson met a model named Dagmar in Germany and quickly married her. Straws began to weigh down the camel. Every week, he'd tell us what was wrong with us, Bunny Carlos says. Stuff he'd been hearing from his wife. Oh, that always goes well. History of every great rock band, whenever they start hearing from someone's wife, things are on their way to fall apartsville. Holy smokes. All the songs should be about sex. Rick and Bun E, you guys look terrible on stage. You should be back in the dock. And it should be me and Robin out front. And I should be singing half the songs. The Camel finally collapsed at AIR Studios in the Caribbean island of Montserrat during the recording of All Shook Up. Despite the success of Dream Police, the band felt it was time to move on from Tom Wehrman. We had done this LA drum and guitar sound, Carlos said. We wanted to get better sounds. He says the decision to hire George Martin was easy. Who's the greatest producer in the world? The guy that did the Beatles, obviously. The executives at Epic bristled at the mention of Martin, whose last hit was the successful but widely derided soundtrack to the movie Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which featured Aerosmith's version of Come Together. Carlos remembers the label's chorus of nays. George Martin, that old guy, forget it, no way. The more they said that, the more we said, we're using George Martin, he recalls. The label won't support George Martin? No problem. We'll give him the fucking money. The label by then was getting a little toxic. So too were relationships among some of the musicians. After they'd finished recording basic tracks, which took around 3 weeks, the bassist told his bandmates he needed to fly to Los Angeles, where he and his wife were living, to deal with mud in their swimming pool. The band completed the album at Martin's London studio without him. Cheap Trick saw the opportunity to work with Martin and his beloved engineer, Jeff Emmerich, as a chance to indulge their Beatles fanaticism and cut a record that sonically, at least, would resemble one of the Fab Fours. We use the Beatles as a point of reference because they worked with the Beatles, and we knew the Beatles, says Carlos, who remembers the musicians constantly asking, so how do we get it to sound like that right there? When Peterson was laying down the bass track for Stop This Game, he asked Emmerich what Paul McCartney used on Rain, tried to replicate that sound. He succeeded. Released in October 1980, the album revealed a band unsure of where they fit in or even who they were, as they badly aped a bunch of groups that were not necessarily named the Beatles. The LP's surreal cover collage with Nielsen in a checkerboard getup, staring bug-eyed at a flying locomotive, as Carlos in a black trench coat and fedora clearly pitched Cheap Trick as a new wave band. And it may have even inspired the design of the Cars You Might Think video 4 years later. But, with the exception of the dystopic vocoder on High Priest of Rhythmic Noise, they didn't sound much like one. And the divide in quality between the songs on side 1, Blam, and those on side 2, Blah, had till that point never been so pronounced. Now there's a good couple of pages here from the Stop This Game chapter of the book that go into the details of, you know, how the songs sound and stuff, and some details about making them and recording them with George Martin. Kind of nice. But the point of this section for me was just to talk about how they had to fire their bass player. So as of August 26th, 1980, 2 months before the album comes out, and 3 weeks after Pete Comida ended up replacing him, Peterson was officially out of the band. He later said that it was playing 300 nights a year and recording 2 albums a year during their time off that did him in. After a while, we got to the point where we were successful, but we were still on this schedule and still doing albums in 2 or 3 weeks, he said. We needed more time to think, to air out, and encourage the creativity to write. Nobody wanted to do that. 40 years later, Carlos regrets the decision to fire the bassist. We should have called the office and gone, we need some time off. You'll go bankrupt. You've got to work or you're going to die. That was always that from Ken and the label. The drummer wishes that counseling had been available to the band. The only way we knew how to deal with it was, let's get this guy out of here, and that was a big mistake. According to Nielsen, we never should have gotten into that position, one that he says was brought on by Adamani and Dagmar, whom he felt tried to divide and conquer the band. Peterson's relentlessness, he believed, could have been better handled. A creative manager, he said, would figure out how to do it and keep the core going at the same time. With a few gigs upcoming in Canada and a return to Tokyo imminent, Adamani drafted Komida, the guitarist formerly of the Chicago band The Thumbs, whom he managed a few years earlier, to quickly learn the set. Although a talented songwriter in his own right, Reach Out, a catchy new wavy number that he co-wrote, that Cheap Trick recorded for the 1981 animated science fiction movie Heavy Metal, see, I'm tying it all in, is one of their best from this period. Komida displayed capricious behavior that soon eclipsed his usefulness. Komida has said his free-spirited, happy-go-lucky personality rubbed the band the wrong way, but the band saw things differently. We knew Pete was a party dog, said Carlos, but we didn't know how much of a party dog he was. There you go. That's the Cheap Trick section. There will be more, as I said, on the Rock and Rule episode someday. So the history of the making of Heavy Metal, the film. There's a lot going into this, and it was fun to do the research. I initially started by going back to a couple of videos I'd sort of seen years ago on YouTube, and then I bailed, realizing that I was going to be just fine with what I was already doing on my own, watching the making of retrospective on the DVD, and then listening to Carl Macek's commentary track on the work print version of the movie that's also on the DVD. If you want to watch this and you don't have the means to get it, I am including in the description of the episode a link to the Internet Archive, the Heavy Metal Neverwhere Land edition. And there's some details in the description of that when you go to click on it that'll sort of explain things. But it's also mentioned in the DVD commentary that the Neverwhere section was going to like link all this stuff in the middle of the movie to the Lochnar sort of causing bad things to happen across a few centuries of human existence. And it was going to be set to Pink Floyd's Time. I don't know how confident they were they're going to get the rights to that, but I think that would have been a bit of an issue, maybe. And definitely for future releases, it would have been really tough to put out. If you are hardcore about this movie and you want to know the extra details about who exactly was animating certain parts, not definitively, not the whole way through necessarily, but the guy that's got the info is Carl. And I don't recommend the average fan of heavy metal, pay the expense to get it just so you can listen to his commentary on the track. But if you're a huge film fan, it's probably worth it for you to see the work print version, the original sketches and stuff they were kind of working off of. But that means you also have to sit through this.
She's the secretary working for the military guy. I think of the senator, one of those characters. What's interesting here is how the nature of the backgrounds are in relationship to the characters. Notice that you can see the hair on Gloria here. It's kind of swept up and kind of perky. And when you see the storyboard, it's a completely different look to the hair. It's kind of longer and over the shoulders. You can sort of see the evolution.
Which was rough for me to do. It took me a couple of days to get through the whole movie that way. Lots of respect for Carl. I've been a fan of his writing about Robotech since I was in like 7th grade, and I discovered all these books that were at the library. Eventually bought used copies of them, Robotech Art 1 and Robotech Art 3, and his commentary tracks on the Robotech DVDs when they came out. I still have all of those for the Macross saga. Really informative. I was a big fan of the Robotech 2, the Sentinels comic books when I was in 7th, 8th grade, when those were coming out. I was kind of playing catch up with Robotech stuff. Even read some of the novelizations of those adventures, some of which, were animated, some of which were not, most of which were not when it came to the Sentinels. Turns out Jack McKinney, who was the credited author on like 25 of those Robotech novelizations, was actually a ghost writer, pen name, nom de plume for multiple people, at least two different authors, it turns out. Now, I say that I decided just to not go into the YouTube video retrospectives because I was getting frustrated that, you're not supposed to compare yourself to other people and their success, but it drives me up the wall when I look at a YouTube channel that has like 500,000 subscribers. And the title of the piece is 10 Things You Didn't Know About Heavy Metal, the Movie. Number 1, based on a comic book. That's the number one thing everyone knows about Heavy Metal, the Movie, you asshole, that it's based on a comic book. Or rather, a magazine. Jeez. Oh, God. And then another one was about the history of the character of Taarna and the young woman who was doing the whole thing. I mean, she clearly worked very hard on her video, and she's got over 500,000 subscribers for a reason. It was very well presented, but it did sort of miss out on the basic fact that Taarna was a character created for the movie because they couldn't get the rights to the original Moebius character they were going for. So what you get is a female character. I mean, according to everything that I've found about the making of the movie, a made-up female character specifically for the film that was later adapted into future issues of Heavy Metal magazine and comics. Not one that was like pulled from the old school 70s stuff. On the subject of Taarna, though, and that sequence, I will punish you now with a return to the Carl Macek audio, just for this chunk that I when I heard it decided I think the listeners need to hear this part, and might as well use his voice explaining it, because I don't want to like translate it into J language and then put it out to you. If you're a fan of, cell animation from this period, I think this detail here is really interesting. There was a lot that went into filming this movie, and it took a lot of, reusing old Disney techniques as other animation studios would be doing at the time, and trying to make things look as impactful as possible, with as many different sort of tricky real world methods to do it. Obviously, this is way before computer animation. I believe Rock and Rule is credited as the first theatrically released feature that had computerized work being done on the animation as an element of the process, not primarily, what you were seeing being done by a computer necessarily. So here's a bit from Carl about this really amazing shot of Taarna riding her giant chicken lizard thing, and how the camera pans around her. All right, we are at 1 hour 14 minutes of the work print with Carl's audio track commentary playing, and I think this is relevant to save for the episode of the podcast and not have me re-explain.
Fascinating coming up here is one of the most unusual shots in animation. It's a pan that goes about 180 degrees. Now you're looking straight at the camera. Now the camera's panning over or under as the creature goes by, and now you're looking in the total opposite direction. What's fascinating about the shot is that the background drawing had to be continuous. So on one piece of paper, it was about 7 feet long. It went from a shot that the camera was looking parallel to the horizon, to a shot where it was looking perpendicular to the horizon, to a shot where it was looking parallel to the horizon in the opposite direction. So it had a full range of camera movement on a background. So imagine the mindset that you'd have to get into to actually draw something on a continuous drawing that would switch perspective like that.
Now, for something like that, I'll sit through Carl's super preamped voice with the mouth noises coming at like straight into your ear balls. Oh my God. Just that old people, stop it. Stop sitting so close to the Shure SM57 with the gain all the way up, talking about you scumbags that keep going on Joe Rogan like Brett and Heather and Eric Weinstein. They just can't help themselves. They love the sound of their own voices. And in Carl's case, that background hum is there throughout the entire commentary track. It's so maddening. Oh, boy. I really do hate knowing this much. What little I do know about audio production that I can pull off on my own. Oh, it's just, it makes the casual nature of how other people do it and the things they don't consider on behalf of the listener just so maddening to me. It's just inconsiderate. It's ignorance. They're not doing it on purpose to drive me crazy, but it still has the same effect. And his notes on the thing are cool. Like I said, if you're a completist, if you're an absolute nut for animation history, check it out if you can. But otherwise, there's plenty of dead spots. He's not very lively. He's very low energy, and he'll, during the den sequence with, John Candy's character is a teenage boy that turns into this giant hulking brute on another planet. And, he's like looking at his own body. He's like, oh, and he looks down and goes, big. And the commentary from Carlos, like, well, wait, let me take the foam off the mic for this and get closer. When we did the voice, the part where he looks down at his body and says, big, that was supposed to be a funny thing. Go back and watch it. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that's not a dead-on impression of his delivery during that part. Or don't go do that. Have a life. Have a life. Listen to me instead. Don't waste your time being petty on my behalf. Now, not being a dude that ever got into, I don't know, so-called heavy metal bands with keyboards in them, except for, an exception when a heavy metal band without a keyboard would do synth stuff every now and then, like Iron Maiden's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son album I love, even though I don't think it's one of their best sounding. I think it's got some of the, I don't know, some pretty great songs on it. And I'm a sucker for Adrian Smith, the guitar playing, but he did a lot of synth on that with some like Roland gizmo, I think, at the time. Point is, I'm not the target market for Blue Oyster Cult. Now, if I was a teenager in the late 70s and I was too young to have been like blown away by the first Zeppelin record when it came out in 1969, and I was, reading paperback novels with aliens and spaceships and, whatever's on them, hand painted, with the mysterious symbols and adventure characters. I would probably be like I would probably be walking around with a grown out sort of Luke Skywalker haircut and a crappy teenage mustache and a jean jacket with that sort of like hook symbol Blue Oyster Cult insignia on the back of it. I can totally see being someone that was a little more into sort of the mystery and the symbolism and the weirdness of that band and their interesting songwriting. However, because I was born too late, a lot of what I've heard from them sounds intensely corny to me. I will say, for their time, though, I can appreciate the influences that they had on bands that I love. Most notably, Metallica was always a big proponent of their stuff, and especially when Cliff Burton was in the band, I believe. They were something original and interesting and intellectual, and I think just sort of an outgrowth of that psychedelic culture and a very literary kind of band in a way that, bands like Rush, I can't really get into them. I can't get into a lot of bands that sing songs that are supposed to be taken word for word literally, like they're describing things that are happening in a fantasy, in an epic fantasy sort of situation. For whatever reason, there's a few Iron Maiden songs that doesn't bother me when they're talking about fighting in World War I or something. But I say all this because in every episode, I got to get my biases out of the way so how I'm filtering through some of this information and judging things. I'm a bad judge when it comes to Blue Oyster Cult. Now, I first heard them because Metallica covered the song Astronomy in 1999. I loved it. I'd already heard them as a youth, as a teen on classic rock radio. So, of course, I was familiar with all the basics, Burnin' For You and Don't Fear the Reaper, stuff like that. And, the stuff that you would just catch all the time and when you're flipping through the channels and stuff. But Astronomy seemed like something a little different, and I kind of dug that. And then I eventually found out through YouTube that there was a late 80s re-recording of Astronomy that featured intro and outro narration from Stephen King. Holy smokes! So watched that a couple times when I first found it. Thought it was pretty neat. Also unrelatable and dated in its production style, but whatever. For me personally, I don't know. I guess I just dig the Metallica version. What could I do? But here's something I didn't understand until today. The redone version of Astronomy was on the Imaginos album, and the character of Imaginos is introduced by Stephen King. Came out in July 1988. There are a ton of players on this record and additional singers and performers and stuff, not least of which the guitar orchestra of the state of Imaginos. Mark Biederman, Kevin Carlson, I'm not familiar. Tommy Moore and Giello, not familiar. Robbie Krieger, One of my biggest guitar heroes of all time from The Doors, Aldo Nova, the band that has a bit of a similar sound sometimes to some Blue Oyster Cult songs sometimes. And I got to say, I'm a total sucker for the Medicine Man song and video that came out around 1991 when I first got MTV. Aldo Nova was pretty much dated and passé by that time, but they did have a brunette in that video that looked a lot like Heather Langenkamp from Just the Ten of Us and the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. So I've got a weak spot for that. That song's great. I don't like the guitar tones on it. For what it is, for a bunch of older guys trying to like rock out in 1991, it's a pretty good effort, I'd say. And besides Aldo Nova and someone named Jack Rigg, Joe Satriani, holy smokes. What? Like, how does that grouping come together? I want a book about the guitar orchestra of the state of Imaginos. Hopefully I can bug some people that I know that live in California that might walk closer to those circles than I do and try to find out what the history of that is. Satriani, I guess, plays leads on a song called The Siege and Investiture of Baron von Frankenstein's Castle at Wyceria. And Robbie Krieger plays the leads on a song called Blue Oyster Cult, which I guess if I want to know more about the band, I should check out that song. Maybe it's an origin story of some kind. I always wonder what the Blue Oyster Cult was. It just sounds sinister and goofy at the exact same time, that name. And I don't know how much of either of those effects is intentional on the band's part. Now, that has nothing to do with the heavy metal soundtrack and the movie. But what does have to do with that is the fact that they were brought in to the whole soundtrack thing during the time that they were putting out or getting together the Fire of Unknown Origin album, which is a pretty big, famous one for them. And the song that ended up on the soundtrack was Veteran of the Psychic Wars. Okay? Now, that was not a song they wrote with this movie in mind. They did write a song with the movie specifically in mind, and for some reason I haven't found out about yet, that song was specifically turned down because it featured lyrics about what was taking place in the scene that it was written for. What? It's called Vengeance, parentheses, The Pact. And it is like a word for word, shot for shot tale of one of the action scenes in the Taarna vignette, right? I mean, the lyrics are this is what I'm saying about like 70s and 80s heavy metal that I just don't relate to. Like, lyrics are, "Pull him down," the soldier said. "I'll put an arrow in his head," but the bird flew off instead. To save his master, on his back she fled. Her time has come. Riding her bird high in the saddle, she gets her chance to fulfill the pact now. As their leader swoops from the clouds, she sticks him with her sword, then she throws him down. I've listened to the song today. It's a fine Blue Oyster Cult song if you like Blue Oyster Cult. It's not a standout for me. When things are that wordy, there's not enough melody for my stupid caveman rock and roll brain to hang on to, so I'm a bad judge when it comes to the quality of a Blue Oyster Cult song. Again, never liked Rush either, but I think between the two, I'll take me some Blue Oyster Cult over some Rush. At least they're atmospheric and weirder. I would rather listen to Vengeance, The Pact than, say, Bytor and the Snow Dogs. Now, Veteran of the Psychic Wars, ironically, not written for the film, even though like 3 other songs on this album were. Co-written by sci-fi author Michael Moorcock, who also used to run around with those guys in Hawkwind back in the day, and all the way back to, I believe, when Lemmy was still in the band for a short time. Also, I noticed in the credits, the song "Burnin' for You," co-written by Richard Meltzer. I mentioned Richard Meltzer on the episode in February, the Valentine's Day love letter to outlaw badass journalists. He definitely rolled around with that crew in New York City, mingled with the likes and worked with the likes of your Lester Bangs and your Nick Toshis kind of fellas. If you know who those names belong to, you probably listened to that episode already. If you don't, you probably don't care. But he, I guess, wrote a poem that Blue Oyster Cult then took and made into "Burnin' for You." And so he gets co-writing credit on it. It was titled "Burn Out the Day," which Wikipedia says both Albert and Joe attempted to put to music before Buck's music was used. That may have been originally intended for Buck's Flat Out album. The song Vengeance the Pact began as a song called Dakota Silo Sitter with different lyrics by Joe before Albert supplied lyrics based on the movie Heavy Metal and titled it Taarna's Theme. The song, Heavy Metal, the Black and Silver, was originally titled Ear Damage. Piano intro for Joan Crawford, one of Alan Lanier's spotlights in many live BOC shows, was actually written by Joe Bouchard. The object shown on the back cover of the album is an ancient astronomical instrument known as astrolabe, a sort of astronomical computer for solving problems related to time and the position of the sun and stars in the sky. I'm going to go look that up really quick. Hang on. Ooh, this looks awesome. I want one. I want an astrolabe. An astrolabe. Oh, I can buy one on Etsy.com. Let's see. Oh, and there's a YouTube video on how to use them. Good for me. Good for me. So they look super cool, but then when I do a search for Astrolabe Blue Oyster Cult, I keep seeing stuff that's like from Secret Treaties, which is the album that Astronomy was on, and links to that kind of a thing in an image search. So what if I do Astrolabe Blue Oyster Cult Fire of Unknown Origin image search? Okay. Yeah, that's a cool back cover. Damn. Yeah, if I was a teenager when this came out, I would be obsessed with this band probably. That's pretty great. Well, that didn't really help us out with the heavy metal soundtrack all that much, but I still wanted to get into it. The other notes I have on this, these astrolabes could be used to determine time, terrestrial location, or identify stars at night. Their origin can be traced back to 200 BC. Aren't you glad you know that now? I am glad you know that now. Oh yeah, I guess the Imaginos album, jumping ahead in the timeline, I saw a note, this is out of print in the U.S., so I cannot, even if I knew where a record store was that sold the back catalog of Blue Oyster Cult here in the present day where I live, I would not be able to purchase it because it is not in print anymore. Anyway, for all that, I assume I should say something about the song on the soundtrack. I think it was cool. I listened to it for the first time today. Interesting tune. Fairly compelling. Doesn't really rock out too much. What are you going to do? It's of a certain time and production style that's a little bit lightweight for me to get into when it comes to the tone and the sound, but a lot of words, as Blue Oyster Cult songs will have. Good for them. I know I owe this band a lot, though, because two of my favorite bands in the world have to have been heavily influenced, and I'm referring to Monster Magnet and Clutch. Definitely, I can see the through line. I mean, there's a Clutch album called Psychic Warfare, for crying out loud. It came out like 7 years ago, and it's awesome. And their singer, Neil Fallon, has read like every science fiction novel ever written. So I'm sure he was a Blue Oyster Cult guy in some respect, or some part of his history. And I think it stands to reason that Monster Magnet has a connection to Hawkwind, Michael Moorcock, and I would guess Blue Oyster Cult by extension. But hey, if you already like Blue Oyster Cult and you disagree with what I'm saying, it doesn't matter. You already know what the song sounds like on the soundtrack. Good for you. Awesome. This probably, none of this was probably helpful to you at all. But if you're not a Blue Oyster Cult fan, thanks for listening. Now, I am going to include in the description of this episode a link to a big, long piece written by someone at GothicHorrorStories.com. And it's a long article about this person's love of Blue Oyster Cult and discovering Blue Oyster Cult when they were a young person. And I'm going to read a chunk that says, on the symbol for Blue Oyster Cult, their first album cover, designed by a classmate of Perlman's at Stony Brook University, Bill Gawlik, 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 featured an architectural pen and ink drawing in black and white. Above it was the symbol which immediately became the logo for BOC. It's a derivative of the astrological symbol for Saturn, the alchemical symbol for lead, and also associated with Greek god Kronos, as well as the Greek symbol for chaos. It's possible Perlman had given the symbol to Gaulick to incorporate in the graphic, but it's also likely that Perlman simply recognized its power, knew a good thing when he saw it, and molded the band's image around it. Former Oyster Cult bass player Joe Bouchard remembers the process of the logo's creation. Quoted by Martin Popoff, Bouchard recalls he spent a lot of time on it, several weeks, and he had pasted it on the wall in our living room. He would stare at it for hours and hours, and he was so concerned about getting the curve of the logo just right. I remember him debating how that should go for a long time. I remember him actually working on the album cover in our living room for weeks on end. It seemed like he was really obsessed with getting the logo just right. Now, the author says that's in that symbol is one of the keys that make BOC such an enigma. It's instantly familiar. When you look at it closer, you see it varies from what you're used to. I don't know about that sentence. It can mean one of several things. There's no right or wrong answer. The symbol, like Perlman's lyrics, were universal enough that the listener could read their own story into it. I don't know if universal is the right word for the lyrics in Oyster Cult songs. If you wanted to search for historical or occult references outside of the albums, you'd find them. But you never found a black and white answer to the questions their image and music posed. Yaha. So, the publisher in America of the National Lampoon magazine was the distributor, publisher, putting out the Heavy Metal magazine in the USA. Heavy Metal is an American version or offspring, if you will, of a French magazine called Metal Hurlant, if I'm pronouncing it somewhat correctly. METALHURLANT, which I believe just means heavy metal. And they actually have, they had 2 seasons of a TV series on, I think it was on the Sci-Fi Network in America. I only found out about it while doing research. I got a couple of discs from the library. This is side bar tangent, but if you like those kind of, I don't know, anthology shows, that's what I'm trying to think of. The word anthology, you know, like a Tales from the Crypt, but for science fiction kind of a thing. Maybe it's nowhere near the production values of a Black Mirror or whatever. We're talking about stuff that would have been converted over to TV from the pulp what is a pulp magazine kind of, sort of, even though sometimes it's, you know, very well, you know, designed and the art's wonderful and the ideas are really cool. It's still, you know, that's the cool thing about heavy metal or Metal Hurlant, is that you could have some very poetic stuff, you could have some very symbolic stuff, you could have some trashy stuff, just super gory, violent for whatever reason. I don't know how well that translates to a TV show, because if you got to keep it somewhat clean for broadcast television in America, then you're not going to get the sexy stuff and you're not going to get the gory stuff. So then what are you left with? Well, I'll say this. Of the 3 episodes I've watched so far, I'd be pretty annoyed if I actually put time aside each week to see these and was met with what I saw. First episode, pretty cool. Has a cool premise, lots of action, interesting story idea, and then, you know, kind of a twisty surprise ending. Like, oh, this guy's actually screwed, even though he just won. This is not good. That was cool. The next 2, pretty boring, even though one of them had James Marsters, who played Spike in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. Very basic stuff. And it seems like, oh, well, they spent so much money on that first episode to get the show sold that now they are being really cheap on these other ones. But hey, if you can watch it for free, check it out. I would say if you're into sci-fi, fun sci-fi short stories, let me put it that way. I think it's on Amazon Prime streaming in America. So anyhow, I'll be including links to the Internet Archive sources for some examples of the magazine and the stories and stuff. The guys that, you know, got into the magazine at National Lampoon made a deal to, you know, do a movie adaptation. We're talking about Ivan Reitman here, who was connected with the Lampoon crew, and they definitely wanted something, you know, that they could do in contrast to the mainstream Disney stuff, but I think they knew they're not Ralph Bakshi either. they wanted to very consciously pair the animation with, that hard rock songs. And that was part of the whole selling point from the beginning, was to have a really obnoxious, loud rock soundtrack and stuff. He hands the magazines that he's got collected to a couple of dudes that he's working with on the movie Stripes. They start trying to adapt some of the stories in the magazine that interested them. Unfortunately, the rights for a lot of them couldn't be secured because they were from the French version of the magazine, they were French creators, and maybe the stories were adapted to the American heavy metal version into English, but it wasn't as easy as they had hoped to just convince them to let them have the right to adapt into a movie their original creations. So that was the impetus to invent the characters of Harry Canyon and invent the character of Taarna. Even though if you look at the link that I have in the description for the I've already forgotten the name of the original character that Moebius had. It's spelled I found it spelled 3 different ways online in articles. Harzak by Moebius. They decided to just insert a new character that they would play like, Clint Eastwood in A Fistful of Dollars, only it's a stunningly beautiful woman with a sword and flying around on a featherless plucked chicken that's also part pterodactyl or lizard or something. The other original creation that's probably the most important is the Lochnar itself. The green glowing bauble that is pure evil, all of the evil of the universe. And it is traveling from person to person, ruining their life, showing all these horrific things to this little girl. There is, a lot of naivete, let's say, in their approach to making this movie, because none of the folks that got this off the ground had ever worked in animation before. So there's a lot of unpleasant surprises for them when it came to how much effort it was going to take to get everything done, how many different studios they had to hire, and how difficult it would be to pull this in under budget and in time for a release from, I think it was Columbia Pictures. A lot of setbacks. But they did a lot of really cool original stuff, and they solved a lot of problems in very interesting, inventive, hands-on kind of ways. And, interestingly, the person who chiefly animated the B-17 segment was actually a World War II vet. And there was supposed to be a battle sequence at the beginning of that, I guess. That had to get chopped out for time and for money. It was originally called Gremlins instead of B-17. They had rotoscoped a 10-foot handmade model plane they built for this sequence. And rotoscoping is the process where you film something and then trace over the blown up image of that film. That's what Disney started sort of innovating with. I believe it was Snow White. It was as far back as that. So when you see Snow White sort of dancing with her, holding up her dress and stuff, I think I've seen footage of that, and it's pencil and ink form before. Random thought I had while watching: is Taarna the only woman that's not a redhead in this whole thing? I think she is. I think she's the only grown adult woman in this, because she's got the platinum silvery hair. So much of this production takes place in Canada, because the U.S. didn't have enough small animation studios. If you were an animator, you went to Disney or one of the, at this time, I don't know if Don Bluth was up and running as a competitor. I think he was about to leave and take like 10 animators with him and start Bluth Studios. But, like I said, there's Ralph Bakshi. He's running his own business and doing his own hands-on stuff. They can't just, I don't think they could afford him anyways. If they wanted him to do the whole thing, that wasn't going to work. So he knows a guy, Reitman. He'd worked with a Canadian production on a film called Cannibal Girls a few years before. So a lot of the animation takes place at studios in Toronto, a little bit in New York City, though, and some in London. While they're making Stripes, they would grab John Candy when they knew he wasn't being filmed for a little while and bring him into a recording booth and have him do some lines here for Den and for the little robot character in So Beautiful, So Dangerous. And I think there's like a third one in there somewhere that he did as well. They had the same guy he was the actor that played the principal on Animal House. Double Secret Probation. He's in the Captain Stern piece. So it was, you have appearances by Joe Flaherty from SCTV in a couple of spots. I will include a link to a Captain Stern story pages originally done by Bernie Wrightson. Holy smokes. Hey, I know him because I'm a scumbag. I know him from The Dark Tower and Silver Bullet by Stephen King, or Cycle of the Werewolf, rather, by Stephen King. And I've seen a lot of amazing work he did in black ink for his own adaptation of Frankenstein a long time ago. That's worth checking out. But he's done plenty of horror stuff and other, work for novels and comic books and things. Also, one of the writers on some of these segments was Dan O'Bannon. He conceptualized the whole Corvette intro, I think it's called Soft Landing, the B-17 story. He was a co-creator with, Ridley Scott on the original Alien film. Funny enough, in the retrospective documentary, they mention that it is said Ridley Scott had copies of Heavy Metal magazine on the set of Blade Runner, and he was taken, he was inspired by the sort of futuristic look of some of the cityscapes that were supposed to be New York, and that influenced his set design on Blade Runner. Now, Ridley Scott and Dan O'Bannon were sort of joined together because, Dan wrote the screenplay for Alien with an adaptation that he wrote with Ronald Shuzette. Now, he also is the guy that worked with John Carpenter on Dark Star early on when they were doing like film college stuff, excuse me. For a while, he was a special effects supervisor on Jodorowsky's ill-fated production of Dune, which of course never got made, and he was pretty miserable after that fell apart. He was homeless. He had no money. He had, moved, I think, to Europe to work on it and had not much going for him there after that. But he did get a job working on Heavy Metal. He then went on to work on a bunch of other stuff. Tobe Hooper's Life Force, which is a great film I love. He also worked on the remake of Invaders from Mars with Tobe Hooper. He worked on the adaptation of We Could Remember It For You Wholesale by Philip K. Dick, which some of you will know was Total Recall. He also went on to do some work on things like Screamers, Bleeders, Alien vs. Predator. Then I would be remiss if I didn't mention one other amazing film from the 80s that I actually thought of just while watching the old retrospective and hearing these guys talk. The guys, not Dan O'Bannon, but the guys that were, looking back on this era of the early 80s, and they were saying, all the sex and the gore and the violence and stuff, it was really the end of this era of the counterculture. It was screeching to a halt because, Reagan era was coming in and ushering in all of these, family values sort of oriented conversations and really kind of trying to rein the culture back in. And my very first thought was, have any of these guys ever seen Return of the Living Dead, which came out much later than Heavy Metal did? It's all just rampant gore, violence, tits and ass, like blatant, like it's a celebration of it. And it's a lot of fun. And that's what Dan O'Bannon contributed to that era. That was his movie. Directed, and he was a writer on it. He was a writer of the screenplay. Original story was Rudy Ricci, Russell Steiner, and a guy named John A. Russo. And tangent, but to me, John Russo and Dan Bannon are like the Garfunkel and Oates of their respective situations, entertainment business wise. Not a slight against them, because they've, both these guys have done more entertainment and entertained more people than I ever have and probably ever will. But, Russo was the guy that worked with everyone on Night of the Living Dead, but didn't really get the acclaim and the credit that I think rightly went to George Romero. When you split up what their contributions were to the story, and then you see what they both did afterwards, it's sort of apparent that I think, you're justified if you want to back the Romero pony over the Russo pony. Russo got the rights to the term, like Living Dead. Anything of the Living Dead was his to make legally after Night of the Living Dead came out. And then Romero he went on to just do Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Night of the Twilight of the Diary of the Dead, etc., etc. Also, Garfunkel and Oates is a fantastic female comedy acoustic songwriting duo that I highly recommend if you like funny, catchy songs with an entire thesaurus wrapped up in the lyrics of each one. Now, the older I get, the more I appreciate a bit of Stevie Nicks in my life. Sometimes I think of her the way I think of Susie and the Banshees. I don't want to listen to all that catalog, but I think I want to shack up with somebody who does. I want a girlfriend that does. That's what I'm saying. I want a girlfriend that's into Stevie Nicks and Susie and the Banshees. I don't want to have to expend all the energy, time to delve deep into those catalogs myself. I don't think, and I don't know if I did, if it would be quite as effective if I wasn't just romantically entangled with somebody who was into it. Never really got into Fleetwood Mac except for some of the Peter Green stuff because I'm a guitar guy, and I never really, got too deep into Stevie's solo career, but I don't know, recent years, that witchy lady seems to be a lot more interesting to me now, and her songwriting style especially. I have a hard time kind of predicting where things are going to go with her tunes when I hear them for the first time, and the song from the heavy metal soundtrack is no exception. Blue Lamp. I thought it was Blue Lantern, but I looked up some stories about it from goldduststevie.tumblr.com. Evidently a fan account that tracks a lot of info about Stevie's career. And it says that the Blue Lamp is one of my very favorite songs. This is Stevie's quote. Blue Lamp was written about a blue lamp that my mother gave me when I first joined Fleetwood Mac. A very heavy leaded glass lamp that I carried on an airplane home with a friend of mine. She carried the bass and I carried the shade home to L.A. And we were really afraid if it was going to get broken because it was this, leaded glass lamp. They didn't want us to take it on the plane because it was too big. Well, we got it on the plane by screaming and yelling and crying. Sounds like delightful people to hang around with. Jeez, imagine. Let's see. So that is the lamp that I carried from my mother's home, and it became and remains my favorite possession. It is the one thing that never changes. It is without a doubt the only light that shines through the shining night much of the time for me. That was from 1981, which of course is when the heavy metal movie and soundtrack came out. And then there's some nice photographs of her with the lamp. She looks very fetching throughout the years. Let's see. I think she's posing with it on the cover of After the Glitter Fades. Evidently, it's a single with Think About It on the B-side. And that's a pretty awesome lamp, actually. I'd probably make a big deal about that, trying to get it home safely. All right. I will also read from a Lester Bangs book about Stevie. Well, not a book about... I'll read a passage about Stevie from the Lester Bangs book. Squeaky chair. Sorry about that. This is also 1981. Ha ha ha. This is a article from the Village Voice. Oh, no, I take it back. June 2nd, 1980. So still period correct. Main lines, Blood Feasts, and Bad Taste. Bad Taste, a Lester Bangs reader, edited by John Morthland. So a lot of good writing in this, even though it's not the original compilation they put out which had some of the more, I guess, some of the earlier stuff, Psychotic Reactions and Carburetor Dung. Stevie Nicks, Lilith or Bimbo. I never met anybody who didn't like Rumors. It got played a lot around my house in the year of anarchy in the UK and White Riot. And I think the reason why so many people who got airsick of being in the same room with Eagles records might find songs like Dreams bringing them to tears was that Fleetwood Mac transcended FM Hollywood, not only by playing and singing with open-eyed passion, but by articulating the painful questions of love and the real answers that hurt. Thunder only happens when it's raining. Players only love you when they're playing. May have been obvious, but that was its very purity. You had been there and could remember all too well when you first learned you can't change anybody. The song was so honest and accurate that it became heartbreak instead of just being about it. It was cleansing for everyone who heard it, which was everyone, period. I guess what it comes down to is where you live, and I don't just mean Hollywood or New York. That's part of it, but it's too easy. Stevie Nicks may be a space case, a terminal mutation of the genius superstar. Her manicurist gets a liner credit. And at times, emetically narcissistic, the cover, which is thoroughly repulsive from where I sit as a man or graphics fan, is the worst thing about Bella Donna, her successful bid for solo stardom. The best things about it are state-of-the-art production, the husky passion of her voice, and her melodies, which are so tenacious I'm still listening a full 2 months after I first bought this record and decided it was a bunch of shit. The reason I think it's a bunch of shit is Stevie's emetic narcissism. And one reason I'm still listening to it is I think emetic narcissism is funny. Gotta find a way to live with it after all. Take the cover. If you think of yourself as a witch, you could probably count yourself in Stevie's constituency. I may not even mind that she's giving you the finger on the back. All right, I should look up the cover. Hang on. Ah, she is giving you the finger while she's holding up her tambourine on the back cover. And, oh, this is the album that has Stop Dragging My Heart Around. I gotcha. And Edge of 17, Leather and Lace. Got it. Know those tunes. Jimmy Iovine produced this. Oh, that's right. Yeah, that was a big chunk of that early part of the documentary, The Defiant Ones. If you haven't seen The Defiant Ones, highly recommend. Story of Jimmy Iovine, interwoven with the story of Dr. Dre and their sort of mutual endeavors as the driving force behind Interscope Records eventually when their paths crossed. But anyway, apparently the back cover was replaced with a re-release, or maybe sooner. I'm not quite sure what the full story is. I could Wikipedia that probably, but if you know Stevie Nicks' solo career, you probably already know what the hell the story is, so I will get back on track here. Let's see. There's a little article by Joe Rock from July 26th, 2021 on 971theriver.com. July 27th, 81, Stevie Nicks released her debut solo album, Bella Donna. Stevie's plan for a solo album was to make a Tom Petty record, straight up rock and roll. At this point, Stevie hadn't met Tom yet. She also wanted to sing with her two backing singers, like Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Once she told people who were on her team about her plan for her first solo album, the next thing was to secure a producer. Since her goal was to make a Tom Petty record, she went with Tom's producer, Jimmy Iovine. The album featured the songs I just mentioned, and it reached platinum status October 81. Stayed on the Billboard charts for 3 years, Jesus Christ, from July 81 to June 84. And then there's a link to her Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction speech. Who cares? Back to the Lester Bangs review. Let's see. Some listeners may be more unnerved by the fact that the front cover credits a different hairstylist than the back and inner sleeve, and it damn sure looks like the same haircut. Demand your money back. Finally, those are the dumbest shoes since the halcyon days of the Quaalude and the Tubes. What kind of witch wears stacked heels? But people don't buy records for shoes, they buy them for songs. And now we're back in a bunch of shit territory again. There really are still some people who believe a love song says, I love you because you are like this and thus and so. Not, I love you because I am like this and that and the other thing. Somewhere they exist. Though, whether even they would want to listen to former tune genre at this point is admittedly questionable. Stevie, who has been known to come out with lines as good as, when you build your house, then call me home, compares herself here to a moon, a highway woman, the kind of woman that'll haunt you, a white-winged dove, and the sea. It's probably no wonder she really finds time on this album to feel or write about anybody else. Although in Edge of 17, the album's centerpiece of tragicomic melodrama, she does anguish over lusting like the sea and then laying a 16-year-old boy. Yet in the end, it's all forgivable. Even the fact that songs like The Highwayman are about vermin like the Eagles. They are the Errol Flynns and Tyrone Powers of our day, she exults slyly. So long as I have to live with them, I try to make them into the most wonderful bunch of guys I can possibly think up, Rolling Stone. The truth is that Stevie and her equally celebritous friends have devastating personal problems that such awestruck wretches as Ye, Beyond, the Gerards, or is that Gerards or Gerards, don't have to cop to. As she admits in After the Glitter Fades, she never thought that she would make it here in Hollywood, but she's got so much money coming in the windows and doors, unless gold refers to muggles. And since this is 1981, I should assume we're not talking about Harry Potter with the term muggles. My understanding of that word was from way back in Louis Armstrong times. That a muggle was like a roach or a joint. That she contracts temporary amnesia 4 lines later and decides that it's the only life I've ever known. Certainly must get confusing when there's no speed limit. This is the fast lane. It's just the way that it is here. And given these harrowing trials of mind and body, it's probably a double blessing that she has aforementioned friends, who after all are equally self-referential in their own epics, along for the ride. Leather and Lace, for instance, is dedicated to Waylon Jennings and Jesse Coulter, and sung with Eagle Don Henley. Stevie makes Don into a wonderful guy by putting words into his mouth. Sometimes I cry. Still, I must say I have no curiosity whether Stevie fucked Tom Petty, and if so, who may have dragged whose heart around, nor does anybody I sleep with, nor anybody else they're sleeping with, nor any of the latter's other lovers. Wild, huh? As I'm sure Stevie would be relieved to know. And I must caution her that according to the physician's desk reference, one of the, contraindications of the belladonna alkaloids is that in high or prolonged dosage, they cause temporary amnesia, greatly resembling senility. For the treatment of this type of cellular deterioration, I would probably prescribe Dianol acetamidobenzoate, more popularly known as Diener 250, to be administered orally 3 times daily, though whether via kissing or one's own hand is best left to the individual patient. Devo has a song on the soundtrack. It's a cover of Working in a Coal Mine, and it is on the soundtrack because it was left off their album release from that era, which was Freedom of Choice. Oh yeah, so this is their big breakthrough sort of year, 2 years. This is the era of Devo that if you say the name Devo, this is probably what you think of. This is around the time of like the Whip It video, around that. It was in the top 40 as well. They toured all over the world: Japan, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Canada, as well as the United States. They had started to make appearances on, television programs like Fridays, Don Kirshner's Rock Concert, American Bandstand, and others. They started to get known for their, the dome hats as part of the stage outfit, the red hats, and then they were putting out stuff like their albums of their own songs as elevator music for their fan club, Club Devo, in 81, and later on in 1984. They re-released those on the Easy Listening Disc in 1987, I guess, with almost all of them, because there was 2 missing, apparently. And then a lot of times they started using that as like intro music or playing it over the PA at their own concerts before they come out on the stage. They also put out a live album after this big worldwide tour in 81, and then went on to contribute their cover of Working in the Coal Mine from the Freedom of Choice sessions to the heavy metal film, because Warner Brothers refused to include it on their album, I guess. And then included it as an independent bonus single accompanying their 1981 release, New Traditionalists. And I think that's got my favorite Devo song of all time. Don't call in and correct me if I'm wrong, but Jerkin' Back and Forth. If you've never heard a Devo song you liked and you've only heard a few of them, check out that song. It's actually kind of heavy sounding, in a Devo way. It just bangs that out, and it's got this great keyboard solo and catchy melody in the middle that I used to play on tenor saxophone live when I'd sing the song. And and because it had the word jerking at the beginning of the title, I would say, this next song is totally jerkin' to audiences that didn't get it. No one thought it was funny because no one has seen Josie and the Pussycats as many times as I have. Now, because I have the book, We Got the Neutron Bomb, The Untold Story of L.A. Punk, I am going to just read you the quotes about Devo in it from the Devo chapter. Getting Devoed, 1977. Gerald Cassale. The hardcore punk Swazi never accepted Devo and always said that we were transplants, but we transformed in a much more intense way by coming to Los Angeles. We were pissed off spuds with a plan and had a lot to say, but LA really organized the way we could say it. It made us super dedicated and committed to being the best Devo we could be. Our sense of how we connected with a culture and an audience completely came into being there. We were infants until we came to LA, and this was our coming-of-age experience. Matt Groening. Devo was probably my favorite band at the time. They went way out of their way to have fun with it in films and costumes and their own language, and I thought it was a hoot. Jed the Fish. I became obsessed with everything about this band. Mark Mothersbaugh. People were trying to figure out what the fuck Devo was, so they lumped us in with the punks. We enjoyed the camaraderie with the punks. Some people thought of us as an art band, but if the Tubes were considered an art band, I didn't want to be an art band. We had more things in common with the punks. We were angry with the system. Gerald Cassale. Back home in Ohio, Devo were considered the biggest asshole losers because none of us had long hair. None of us drove around in vans. None of us were managers of McDonald's. We had menial jobs, and we spent our free time writing and recording in the basement of a rented house. We did graphics and writings on the philosophy of de-evolution. And people were like, oh, these poor fucks, what losers. They're out of their minds. Mark Mothersbaugh. We'd lie to clubs and say we were a top 40 band. It was rare if we got to play through the whole night. It incited people to want to get in fights with us. We'd go, here's another song by Foghat. It's called Mongoloid. These were people who just got off work at the tire factory, and they're like, I don't need this shit. There'd be stuff flying at the stage, and these long-haired gnarlers coming at us going, you calling me a monkey? That what you're saying? John Doe of the band X. People knew Devo for some reason, so that's what Hicks would yell out of their pickups to slag you. Devo or fag. And Henry Rollins said something similar about when he was young and working at a Haagen-Dazs in Washington, D.C. People just like shout Devo at you like it was derogatory if you looked like a punk. Also, he said it didn't do himself any favors because he dressed like a Devo band member at one point when he came to work. He had the like jumpsuit and I think in some kind of a approximation of the hat or the helmet. You could elicit that response just by wearing tight black jeans and a leather jacket with a regular haircut. Here we were in Hollywood, where you're supposed to be able to do anything and not faze people. And the general public was offended by this style. Everyone I knew just scratched their head, wondering what it was that pissed people off so much. But it gave you the feeling that you were fighting the good fight. Back to Gerald. Many punks have told me that they got sneered at, chased, or beaten up and been called Devo. And Devo didn't even wear Ramones-style leather jackets and ripped jeans or any of the English safety pin stuff. On stage, we had a distinct graphic presence of our own, which had nothing to do with the classic Brit punk style. And off stage, we were typical anonymous-looking white lower-middle-class nerds from the Midwest. So it's really strange to us that anybody who dyed their hair or wore personalized clothing got screamed at and called Devo from passing trucks. Devo became synonymous with being different. We became this iconic new wave punk identity the general public could grab onto that didn't have the faintest idea of what was going on. So everything got lumped under Devo if it was different or weird. And then the final quote from Mark Mothersbaugh, so many people got their asses kicked and called Devo for dressing punk. The lightning rod for hostility that we were in Ohio kind of continued on all of our fans. Even people who weren't fans, all they had to do was be different from the norm. And that was like some kind of badge, Devo. It was accusatorial. And when they said it, they usually meant it as a condemnation. We were shocked by it, but we were like, it happens to us too. We understand. From Rip It Up and Start Again, Post-Punk, 1978 to 84, by Simon Reynolds. We'll start with a quote. Devo. It's like the Titanic going down or something. Alan Ravenstein once said of their Akron allies, who early on often shared stages with Per Ubu. apologize if it's Pere Ubu. But I'm not going to go on YouTube and find out how to pronounce it right now. Or trust whoever's pronouncing it. It's not like I could find just like an MTV countdown, top 20, Pere Ubu. And if I did, I would also not believe they were pronouncing it correctly. So, but that's a name that goes back to the first Soundgarden episode of A History of Rock and Roll in Film and Rock and Roll. And I think it was like Kim Thile from Soundgarden was at one of their shows when he made friends with some other local musicians that his life would be entwined with forever. Similarly, he was at a St. Vitus show in Seattle where he figured out what down tuning your guitar was, and that changed all of our perception of what, modern music would be in the 90s. Yes, I know Black Sabbath did it in the 70s. Everyone knows that. But that's beside the point. It's like a lot of bullshit political arguments that keep coming back up, and if you're old enough, you're like, but this is what people were doing 20 years ago. They're just saying the same thing. Yes, that's how it works. That's exactly how it works. You just do it over again. Anyway, sorry. Been watching too much political YouTube lately. Or was I? Oh, yes. The impression I got from their songs and from talking with them is that they're really much more into making a mockery of everything, not really giving a damn. Actually, Devo's cynicism was born of having once cared too much. Unlike Ubu, Devo had been hippies of a sort. Gerald V. Casale and Mark Mothersbaugh, the group's conceptual core, were among the anti-war students protesting at Kent State University, Ohio, on the 4th of May, 1970, when the National Guard opened fire. Two of the four slain students, Allison Krauss and Jeffrey Miller, were friends of Casale. They were just really smart, liberal kids, 18 and 19, doing what we all did back then, he said. They weren't crazy sociopaths. He recalls the dazed, slow-motion sensation when the guns started firing, like being in a car accident. The blood streaming down the sidewalk, the eerie sound of moaning from the crowd, like a kennel of hurt puppies. At first, even the National Guard was frozen, freaked out. Then they marched us off campus, and the university was shut down for 3 months. That date in May 1970 is one of the several contenders for the day the 60s died. For me, it was the turning point, says Casale bitterly. Suddenly, I saw it all clearly. All these students with their idealism, it was very naive. Participants in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, like Casale, reached a crossroads. After Kent, it seemed like you could either join a guerrilla group like the Weather Underground, actually try assassinating some of these evil people, the way they'd murdered anybody in the 60s who tried to make a difference, or you could just make some kind of whacked out, creative Dada art response, which is what Devo did. Dada, from my understanding, I've learned more about it by looking into the careers of Zappa and the Residents. If you've heard the term before, you might know. I can't say that I know. Mostly, I've understood it to be like art for art's sake, wacky, provocative. There's meaning and intent behind it, but it's hard for the average person to discern what that meaning is. It's sort of a, hey, if it makes you uncomfortable, that's fine. If it makes perfect sense to you, that's fine. But it's not clear what the point of the art is going to be necessarily and who it's for. There's a bit of Dada in Gaga for sure. And I think there's some Dada in like modern protest tactics as well. Whatever sort of gets people talking and paying attention. But it's, I think the purest form of it is expression for expression's sake, especially when it's off-putting. Let's see. Devo was born in those 3 months that Kent was closed down. Jerry would come around my house and we started writing music, said Mothersbaugh. He'd first noticed Casale because of a prankster performance art piece he'd done during fine art faculty shows. I'd be this character, Gorge, who wore an enema bag bandolier, says Casale. My sidekick, Poot Man, dressed in black wrestling shorts and a black full-face mask like those Mexican wrestlers. He walked around like a monkey, knuckles trailing on the ground. The art was always bad. Derivative stuff. Endless, mindless landscapes and still lifes. I pointed a picture and go, Poot Man! And he'd rub his ass on the artwork or hold his nose like it stunk. Every time Poot Man took a pretend shit on the graduate student art, I'd reward him with milk, which he'd suck through the enema tube. People would be disgusted and move out of the way. I'm reading these words for the first time. I've owned this book for like 2 years in preparation for creating the podcast. I read through chunks of this and like tried to bookmark some stuff that might be helpful to me, because I realized I knew nothing about like post-punk and new wave from a like scholarly point of view. And I was like, wow, this seems to be the most respected book on the subject. And it just has, because coming up with movies to tie the stuff to has been a slow process, even though I know I have a list, but they're not the most compelling list because it's hard to join it with stuff that people can actively find links to or easily and inexpensively watch. Let me put it that way. The no wave movement of film is very tiring to behold and hard to, in some cases, to get your hands on. Whew. Excuse me. That was great. After a few of these events. Oh, wait. They'd be waiting for us because somebody would go get security. Says Mothersbaugh, I saw him do the Poot Man thing, and I was like, who is this guy? Everybody hated Jerry, so I knew I was going to like him. Casale, meanwhile, had already admiringly noted Mothersbaugh's artwork. Decals of puking heads in profile. For a band that later defined new wave music, Casale's and Mothersbaugh's roots were uncompromising. Take it back. The word is not uncompromising. The word is unpromising, which is not a word I've ever read in print or heard in action before. Mark was playing in a band that did Yes and Emerson Lake Palmer covers, said Casale. He had long hair down to his waist and a stack of keyboards. An accomplished bassist, Casale had played in numerous blues bands and was steeped in everything from the original Delta blues to electric Chicago sound. Prog and blues collided in a mutual passion for Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band. But everything that was primal and earthy about Beefheart became deliberately sterile and stilted in Devo's hands. Their quest, says Casale. And I'm sorry if you're a Devo fan, you're like, it's Casale! I don't know. I'm sorry. I apologize. But that's the point. Devo, it seems to me like minimizing the individuality was the point. I'm not supposed to know how to pronounce everyone's name in this goddamn band. Their quest was to discover what devolved music would sound like. We wanted to make outer space caveman music. Oh, God, I love that idea. Instead of like outer space, progressive, robot science, NASA music. Devo's other big inspiration was the glam grotesquerie of early Roxy music. You can hear Brian Ferry's android vibrato in Mothersbaugh's Edge of Hysteria bleat, while his synth spurts owe a lot to Eno. I loved his asymmetric, atonal synth solos in Roxy. He brought a whole new way to think about that instrument, as opposed to Rick Wakeman and Keith Emerson, who just sounded like glorified organists. I used to write synth parts I could play with a fist instead of fingers. We were looking for sounds like V2 rockets and mortar blasts, things that weren't on the settings when you bought a synth. Meaning not the stuff that came like pre-programmed with the, push this button for a French horn, which always sound like, stuff that Mothersbaugh would use later in the mid-'80s when he was doing the score soundtrack for episodes of Pee-wee's Playhouse. Because, you can't pay Danny Elfman to do every single episode of Pee-wee's Playhouse, but you can pay Mark Mothersbaugh. If you don't know, I'm saying that because it was Elfman that scored Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Anywho, I used to blah, 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 blah. Rather than a keyboard, Devo treated the synth as a noise generator. The more technology you have, the more primitive you can be, Mothersbaugh told one interviewer. You can express guttural sounds, bird noises, brainwaves, blood flow. In Devo's earliest days, the group experimented with machine rhythm. Our first drummer was my youngest brother, Jim, who left to be an inventor, says Mothersbaugh. He created a homemade electronic drum kit using acoustic drums with guitar pickups attached to their heads. Oh, this is great. I love this. Because guitar pickups could be, I mean, they're usually some, like a magnetized strip of metal or a coil of copper wire around a magnet or something like that. And then when you interrupt the magnetic field and then carry it through copper wire to something that will amplify it, like tubes or transistors, to make it louder, that's how you get electric guitar sounds. But you can use that on, people use that sort of thing on banjos and drums and marimbas and, mandolins, whatever, to sort of have a semi-acoustic sound, but not really, to get rid of like the danger of having certain kinds of hollow feedback from a microphone type thing. It's more of like a surface-mounted microphone. A lot of you might be like, yes, Jay, we know. God, you know how stuff works with electric guitars. But, some folks don't. This is where the sound of a lot of electric stringed instruments comes from. And to be a young person and go, what if I just taped these to a bunch of drums and then manipulate the sound, like the horrible, horrific sounds that come out of it afterwards, instead of having a synthesizer drum set do that everyone else is doing. That's a fantastic idea. And then he would, there we go. He would feed that signal into wah-wah pedals, fuzz tones, and echoplexes, which those are like the three examples of the earliest guitar foot pedals that helped people in the 60s create, a lot of the crazier noises that you hear from Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page or Jeff Beck, folks like that. David Gilmour, Pink Floyd, especially. And then it sounded really amazing, like a walking, broken down robot. Ultimately, Devo found Alan Myers, this incredible metronomic drummer. And the group started to explore disconcertingly disjointed time signatures like 7/8 and 11/8. Those timings make you feel rigid right away, says Casale. In the early to mid-70s, with punk barely a glimmer on the horizon, Devo defined themselves against the ruling American mainstream rock of the day, chugging feel-good boogie and slack country rock. Just as the music's twitchy angularity was the antithesis of FM radio's soft rock, likewise Devo's attitude, neurotic, uptight, stiff-necked, revolted against those chilled-out baby boomers. We were anything but hippies, loose, natural. Casale recalled years later, Devo rejected all those flabby leftover ideas from the 60s that by 1972 had degenerated into self-absorbed and complacent hedonism. Back then, their ungroovy rhythms, midway between spasm and stricture, were as appealing to Akron audiences as a cup of old puke, because no one wanted to hear original music. Devo pretended to be a cover band to get gigs, and there's the anecdote about, Foghat and Mongoloid that we already went over. Angry hippie factory workers charged the stage to try to stop us. Often we'd get paid just to quit. Sometimes the police would get called. Now, they would put out 2 singles, Satisfaction, their cover of the Rolling Stones song, which one of my favorite little anecdotes from Dana Gould on his podcast years ago. He talked about how, his dad was a bartender in Boston, and he would come home late at night on the weekends after tending bar, often very drunk and very aggro from the kind of, I guess, maybe a lot of patrons getting on his nerves and stuff. And he would see young Dana and his a brother or two watching Saturday Night Live. And he said one time he came home and Dana's watching David Bowie, who's wearing like lipstick, I think, and he had like long curly hair and wearing a women's Royal Air Force uniform, singing. And his dad came up behind him and put his hands on his shoulders, and he leaned down to young Dana's ear and said, "Do you like that queer, Dana?" And then another night he came home and Dana and his brothers were watching Devo playing Satisfaction in their like neon yellow jumpsuits, kind of bopping around, being all angular and weird. And he said, "What the hell is this? The goddamn asshole show?" Great stuff. Oh, great stuff. That's what a dad says. That's what dads will say. So they put out Satisfaction and Jocko Homo and themselves on their own label, and they went on to eventually move out of Akron, as we know, because I read the bit earlier about L.A. They had only played a handful of gigs to like make any money around the area in like the 5 years they were there. They had a ton of shitty jobs. Casale, in particular, had a resume that included being a projectionist in a porno theater, a methadone clinic counselor, and was also a graphic artist at a janitorial supply firm. So they put out, maybe they put out like 5,000 copies of the early singles, or if not those ones that they did. I think I saw a note somewhere about, another independent label that put out stuff by Pierre Ubu and Devo that like, hey, 5,000 is all you get. We put it out to journalists. We put it out to radio stations that are independent or college, send them around the world not around the world, but to Europe at least. And a lot of times back then, that did the job. That was enough to get a band noticed and moved up to some kind of notoriety, playing better gigs, moving to a bigger city, getting noticed by magazines, getting covered in magazines, maybe getting a deal somewhere on a record label that's got a little bit more money and could support them. No one will ever know the effort it took for us to get out of Akron, says Casale, driving down to Cincinnati with just enough cash to get 2,000 copies pressed at Queen City Records. Mark and me sitting up endless nights, gluing together the covers that we'd printed. Akron was like boot camp. We practiced day and night and weekends when other people were out getting loaded and getting laid over and over until we got good. Talk a bit about Black Sabbath around 1981, the Mob Rules era. I am going to be covering the history of Black Sabbath in depth on their own episode about the movie Black Sabbath, the Boris Karloff anthology film. I plan to do that this year around Halloween, since I've done the Misfits the 2 previous years, and I think I've mined all that I can out of that backstory for the most part. There's still more you can learn about them if you want to. If you check out this Music Leaves Stains, the book that I was getting a lot of material from, there's still plenty of stories in there. Let's see. The fun thing about this is that I just get to focus on, I think, one of my favorite examples of in-between metal, early 80s in-between metal. And what I mean by that is I don't naturally have a lot of love and affection for the era of heavy metal that is post, like, I won't say post Zeppelin and post Thin Lizzy. That's the wrong kind of way to present the timeline. Let me put it this way. I have a lot of love for stuff like Zeppelin and Thin Lizzy and the 70s hard rock that featured some amazing guitar players and some very compelling songwriting and performances and great drummers and things like that. Now, I also have a lot of love for some of the bands in the new wave of British heavy metal that came around 79, 80, 81. The obvious examples are Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, though not as much my favorite. I got a lot of respect for him. But, there's Tigers of Pantang, there's Angel Witch, there's a lot of fun bands if you check them. And the Motorhead's lumped in there because of the timeline, but really I think they're just their own beast entirely. They'd been around a little while before that, and they were around a lot longer than most of those other bands do, except for Iron Maiden, obviously, who are still going. There's not a lot in between those when it comes to the emergence of an artist. Okay, I'm not into Anvil. I'm not into that kind of Scorpions stuff where it's a lot of stuff that tends to remind me of the opening scene in Spinal Tap. Like a lot of Gibson guitars with white or cream pickups in them through Marshall stacks and kind of floppy hairdos that aren't quite long hair, but they're not mullets either. They're kind of poodly, but they're not glam rock poodly. some spandex and some bouncy rhythms on the drums, those tom rolls on the drums. So, while there's still elements of that boogie woogie in the new wave of British heavy metal, for some reason it doesn't bug me as much because those bands just sounded kind of cooler because they were a little bit more, they were cheaper, they didn't have a lot of money for recording budgets, and it sounds more charming when it's like lo-fi or recorded in a little less professional way. To me, for some reason, I don't understand why. That's just how it is. When it comes to getting to the slick, well-produced, well-practiced, well-presented heavy metal from the early 80s, I gotta say, the Dio era of Black Sabbath took a long time to win me over because I'm such a fan of the original lineup, especially Bill Ward's drumming and the melodies that Ozzy sang. And besides the amazing playing of Geezer Butler and the writing of the riffs of Tony Iommi, I mean, there's something for me to worship in every single member of that band, quite frankly. But you lose a lot when you lose that rhythm section. And, over the course of the two albums that started out the 80s with Dio, you do lose that feel. You lose the feel immediately. We had Bill Ward in Heaven and Hell, and then he was gone by Mob Rules. So that changes the tone and the sound a lot, and it's slicker and more professional, and that's good for the era. I think Sabbath sounds revitalized on these two records, and even if you only heard the one song Mob Rules from the heavy metal soundtrack, that would do a pretty damn good job of encapsulating what it was all about and the energy that was there. Now, some folks may or may not know, the version you hear in heavy metal and on the heavy metal original soundtrack is not the version you hear on the album Mob Rules. It was recorded at John Lennon's house. I guess that was being rented out as a studio. And funny enough, around a time when John Lennon was recording, I think, with Cheap Trick, who are also on this soundtrack, which is a whole other story. But they did it in a short time, got it out on the soundtrack, and then I believe they went to make the full record in a different studio when they had more time and they weren't like in the middle of playing live dates and stuff. If you compare the two, I think they both stand up pretty well on their own merits. The sound of the production is the main difference. The kick drum and bass sound is a little more thumpy on the heavy metal soundtrack version. I think it got a little more kind of thud to it. The guitar distortion tone definitely has a little bit more fizziness on the high end, that you don't quite hear on the album version. And the vocals are mixed a little higher, I think, a little louder and more prominent in the soundtrack version than the album version, because my only way to qualify or quantify that is that when I listen to the album version of Mob Rules, I'm not so put off by the wackiness of Ronnie James Dio's delivery of the phrase, play with fire and burn your fingers. So I think this kind of heavy metal, stuff from the early 80s is my wheelhouse. These two albums that Black Sabbath did with Dio, they're not too fantasy and power metal-ish. Power metal's got its place. It's got a lot of fans. For those of you that aren't familiar with the term, it's more your sort of galloping, sometimes slower, mid-paced songs about fantasy epics and things like that. More dragons, more hobbits. But Dio certainly has written his share of songs about dragons and stuff, but it's not at the forefront of his writing during his time with Black Sabbath as much. That they have some fantastic epics in this era that I highly recommend. If you never got into this era of Black Sabbath and you're not just put off by Dio's shrieking, and I understand if you are, and if you're not totally put off by the reputation of being a really lazy lyricist, which is how I consider him for the most part, I think the Sabbath stuff's a little bit better than some of his solo stuff. For me personally, there's a lot of solo stuff and a lot of stuff in Rainbow that just to me sounds like Mother Goose nursery rhyme stuff, and it's very lazy, and it's just he thought of a phrase, and then he thought of the first word that would rhyme with the end of that phrase, and then he shoehorned in lyrics to just pad the section, before and after to make it work. So I would definitely say from Heaven and Hell Children of the Sea is dramatic and amazing sounding. The song Heaven and Hell is dramatic and amazing. So if you like the instrumentation of previous Sabbath stuff with a little more a modernization in the early 80s heavy metal kind of style, I would start there. Neon Knights, Lady Evil, those are fun. Die Young kicks a lot of ass. On Mob Rules, Turn Up the Night kicks a lot of ass. Sign of the Southern Cross is a great dramatic one, you know, with your sort of acoustic intro and vocal harmonies going into something heavy. That's just crushes. It's great. E5150, I'd have to look up what the story behind that was, because I don't know if that's just a Van Halen reference, because they toured with Van Halen a few years before this on the last tour with Ozzy. But it sounds to me like it's just another one of those, like Tony Iommi got stoned and started dorking around with guitar effects kind of songs, like FX from, I think it's Sabbath Volume 4. There's a few of those every now and then. Sometimes he did these amazing acoustic guitar interludes, you know, totally instrumental, that I love. And one of my favorite albums of all time is Corrosion of Conformity's Deliverance, where they absolutely, you know, pulled from that idea to sort of break up the flow of their songs. And I totally dig it. I like that effect. And other times there's just Tony Iommi dorking around with effects in the studio, making echoey sounds and warbly sounds and stuff. And someone got paid, I guess, to record it. Country Girl, I was listening to today, is pretty good as well. And those would be my go-tos if you've never, ever, 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 ever listened to this stuff somehow. I know plenty of people might scoff at that idea, but, you know, there might be some younger listeners here to checking this out for the first time. Maybe you're younger and you only tuned into this episode because of the movie Heavy Metal or because of one of the other artists I'm talking about. Maybe you're only here for Stevie Nicks or something. I don't know. Or Devo. If that's the case, you probably don't want to go listen to these songs anyway, if that's your favorite band. But I think people are pretty open-minded about different kinds of, you know, rock and heavy music and punk and new wave and stuff. And it's fun to go back to these times and just reflect on, wow, isn't it great that this stuff was actually finding its audience? You know, whether you're Devo on your second or third album or your Black Sabbath on like your eighth and ninth album, there was room for this stuff to have a fan base and to be heard. How romantic. Go back to a Melody Maker interview from January 31st, 1981 with a Black Sabbath from this era. I'll kind of skip over the introduction. There's a whole lot of filler about the mood outside the venue and the people standing around getting fish and chips and yelling at each other or hitting on girls and drinking wine in the streets. Inside the hall, both support bands had finished and the crowd began to chant for Sabbath. Okay, so interesting timing to start. I guess he assumes he's not going to interview the band right now. He's going to meet up with them first. I hope. I don't know. Unless there's a whole lot of sound checking going on during this interview. Backstage, Ronnie Dio was saying his first words to me. "Hello, have you got Steve Sutherland with you?" he asked in his distinctive American accent. He was referring to the not-so-complimentary review of the band the innocent Sutherland had written in Melody Maker the previous week. I told him no. "Do you know Steve well?" he inquired. "Because you better get to know him well in a short time. He may not be around much longer." Oh, God, here we go again, I thought. Another step in the right direction for the ever-worsening relations between Sabbath and this paper. There was the occasion where Tony Iommi met up with Alan Jones for the first time since Jones had penned a not wildly enthusiastic critique of Tony's lifestyle and musical ability. Tony did the only thing possible. He beat the hell out of him. "No, only joking," says Dio, assuredly patting my shoulder as Iommi, in his all-leather suit, loomed into the dressing room. Ronnie introduces us. "Hello, Tony," I say. Alan sends his regards. A grin appears on his face, and he walks out to tune his guitar. Dio hears the crowd shouting the band's name. "Why are they shouting for Saxon and not us?" he says with a grin. Don't get it. Is it that he's mishearing Sabbath as Saxon, or is he making a joke about it? Or Saxon playing that night? I don't know. But let's jump from this narrative momentarily to the Sutherland piece taken from Melody Maker the previous week. It says, "Stop laughing and listen. It wasn't that bad. Really, it wasn't." Well, okay, that Iommi bloke's guitar solo went on a bit, clocking in at precisely 10 minutes and 53 seconds of pretty standard, yawn-inducing, grease-fingered fretwork padded out with a clever dick time changer, too. Pause for a second on that. I did notice on the expanded version of Mob Rules that I was just streaming this afternoon, there's a ton of live stuff included, as well as a couple remixes, and the heavy metal version of Mob Rules, too, if you want to listen to that. Streaming on whatever service you like. And there was a guitar solo track for a live at Hammersmith Odeon show, I believe. Maybe it wasn't. It was somewhere else. I'm not going to go right now. It's on that tour. And it was only like 3.5, 4 minutes long. And there was a drum solo that was like 3.5, 4 minutes long. So maybe... excuse me. No, this is the Hammersmith Odeon review of the show. That's why that was in my head. So no, that the 3.5, 4 minute solo I'm talking about was from a totally different concert, but from this tour. Maybe at the Hammersmith, Tony got a little froggy and he decided to get a little more long-winded with his soloing. I don't know. I mean, he's one of my favorite guitarists. I don't know if I would want to sit through 10 minutes of Tony soloing. He's got a solo in every single song and they're all great. But I know what his capabilities are. You know, I've seen Kirk Hammett take a long solo all by himself. Didn't need that either. It's the same kind of formulas, basically. So, you know, I'm saying they're not Steve Vai or Joe Satriani or Jimi Hendrix or whatever. Okay. You know that, and I know that. Let's see. I suppose old Vinny Appice's 6-minute drum spot could hardly be said to have broadened the scope of superior sticksmanship. But count your blessings. At least the bassist Geezer Butler had the good sense to keep his shortcomings well and truly buried beneath the overall barrage. So what if Ronnie James Dio did sound like he was having big trouble digesting a brick? His complete ineptitude as a forceful frontman made a welcome change from the excessive rantings of that well-known nutter Ozzy Osbourne. So the ghost of Crowley and Wheatley don't stalk the songs like they used to, and the new ones, Lady Evil and Sweet Leaf from 1971, are dire direction. How is Sweet Leaf a new one? I don't get that. Lady Evil's a new one. Dire directionless dirges. At least there were lots of audience sing-alongs, a super snazzy light show, a glossy fact-filled program, dry ice aplenty, and a note-perfect paranoid to compensate for the abysmal dross drawn from the latest lamentable Heaven and Hell album, which dominated the set. It was opening night, the first of 4, the Sabs on the Sabbath, sold out in advance, an outright success, and an excellent opportunity to indulge in a little banging of Dead. Let's not get bogged down in that old argument about the mindlessness or otherwise of heavy metal. Suffice to say, when the Sabs were good, they were comically corny. But more often than not, they were turgid, tedious, and not half loud enough. It really wasn't that bad. Just bloody dull. That's all. Wow. So you could print that in your magazine, and then a week later, try to get an interview with that same band, albeit from another writer, but they had some serious gall. Clearly no fear. Clearly no fear whatsoever. And it goes on. The dude's kind of shitty about things. This is another one of those good reminders that heavy metal was always looked down on by most journalists. Halfway through the set, a 60-amp fuse decided enough was enough and blew itself up. It stopped Sabbath just as they were beginning to climb to an awesome climax of screaming vocals, wild guitars, and battering drums. This is another problem I have with journalists, like wild guitars. That doesn't describe anything. Battering drums get battered. That's how you play them. That's not a description of any kind of sound or performance. For a second there was silence. Then Sabbath, professionals to the last, grinned, and Dio cracked a few jokes while the amp was being replaced. 5 minutes later, they were back at it again. Their new show consists of a large segment of Heaven and Hell, their last album, interspersed with such all-time classics, and they put classics in quotes, as War Pigs, written about Vietnam back in those alternative lifestyle days, and inevitably paranoid. To boost it further, Tony Iommi treats us to a 20-minute guitar solo, thanks Tone, and Vinny Appice depping for the ill Bill Ward, manages about 7 minutes on his own. Lights flash constantly, smoke bombs explode, dry ice smothers everyone in sight, and fire is exploded on stage by 2 jets either side of Dio. I watch it all from the mixing desk with Dio's wife, Wendy. Interesting to know that they were together all the way back in those days. That's a long marriage. Former actress who endears herself to me by revealing she acted in, among other things, The Lords of Flatbush, one of the all-time great B movies starring Sylvester Stallone and Henry Winkler before he got morals. Don't know what that's a reference to. Halfway through, I slip off to the bar and ask a nervous 14-year-old just exactly what he sees in Black Sabbath and not say The Jam. So there you go. All cards are on the table. The writer likes bands like The Jam and does not like Black Sabbath, but he's there to cover the show. Well, there's no lights or lasers. It's too serious, he stammers out. It hasn't got any glamour, I prompt. No, it just hasn't got any glamour. I return to the desk and watch the youth of Bridlington go stark raving crazy. And there's a quote from Ronnie. We've said it ourselves. Why a 20-minute solo? Why a 10-minute guitar solo? Why a 5-minute guitar solo? Everyone does guitar solos. Fair enough. But after all, it's really the one chance that Tony gets to do his improvisation. Other than guitar solos in Sweet Leaf or whatever other songs, I think he deserves to do that. It's his decision. If he wants to do it, he'll do it. Perhaps it does go on a bit, and we have talked about cutting the solo down, and that was Tony's suggestion. Quote from Geezer, we've never been into fashion anyway. I mean, all you've got to do is look at every concert we've ever done in Britain, which have always been sold out from day one. So we never went out of style because we've had such a good following. You think you're representing what the kids of today want, and we were to a certain amount of kids. Even when punk got big in 76, like before that, when there was nothing coming out between 74 and 76, completely stale in England. We always had that following. We always stuck to our music, and our fans have always stuck to us. You'd be amazed at how many people come to us who have the same feelings about the world as us. They're so into the subjects that we've covered, and they look to us for more information about it. That's what I resent about people who put down our fans as dummies. You've got some real intellectual people into what we're trying to say. Thank you, Geezer. Another good quote from Dio. I'm only giving people options. They can take it this way or that way, but the basic idea is still there. Like Heaven and Hell, to me, was all about injustices, especially to young people. The line which I think ties in the whole album, the whole concept of what I wanted to write about is, the world is full of kings and queens who blind your eyes and steal your dreams. I've seen, Geezer's seen, Tony's seen, and Billy's seen so many people who don't have the talent to create themselves, but have the money to get inside your pocket, inside your soul, and take your artistic talent and turn it into financial benefit. Those are the kings and queens who blind your eyes and steal your dreams, and they do it to everyone. So perhaps what I'm trying to do is keep up the string of social comment. We're middle-class people who believe that the middle-class people are the structure upon which the world is built. And we're trying to say for them, look, king and queen sawed them. Don't let them blind your eyes and steal your dreams. Sound of the Beast, his heavy metal, historical document, which I have found to be the only history of heavy metal all in one volume that is worth buying, at least from what I've looked at and what I've read. that's out there in the world. It is exhaustively researched and very well written, very informative and fun. He's covers the Dio era of Sabbath in a chapter called Heavy Metal America, Highways and Video Waves. Now, it's interesting because he has to sort of backtrack in the timeline a bit to fold in this part of Sabbath, because he's talking about an era that's mostly like 83, 84. You know, at the top of the chapter, you know, he always has bullet points of each one of like, here's some high points in the era that I'm about to talk to you about, right? So the 4 high points in this little list at the top are May 18, 1983. Because previous to this, the chapter was all about early, let's see, the previous one, I'm sorry, everybody, the new wave of British heavy metal is what's going on. And then he goes into the effect that the new wave of British heavy metal had on like early American sort of heavy metal and thrash metal, like your Motley Crues and your Metallicas happening around this time. He talks about Ozzy Osbourne being basically an American artist at this time because he'd moved to California and had a band full of Americans. You know, in this previous chapter from the one I'm about to pull from, he says, there was a homegrown hard rock scene in Los Angeles in the 1980s, struggling against disco in the name of Van Halen. Some bands took up outlandish stage antics in order to break the monotony. Most just soaked up the rays, dyed their hair blonde, and tried to blend into a sea of club clones waiting for the big score. In New York, nobody knew what to do with bands like Riot and Twisted Sister. Nonetheless, it mattered that these groups were competing with the English wave. For all intents and purposes, Ozzy Osbourne's new band was an American entity. Along with Van Halen, Ozzy Osbourne helped usher out Aerosmith, Heart, and the rest of the hard rock strap hangers at the beginning of the 1980s. Soon, Motley Crue, Rat, and the Metal Massacre gang took heavy metal in a whole new direction. And then a list of like recommended listening here. Lita Ford's Out for Blood in 83. Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love in 81. The first 2 Ozzy Osbourne records. Quiet Riot's 2 in 79. Rat's Rat EP in 83. Riot Fire Down Under 81. Twisted Sister Under the Blade 82. A couple of Van Halen. And then various artists. Metal Massacre 1982. And then Y&T's Earthshaker in 81. So we go from that to chapter 4. May 18, 1983, Judas Priest, Screaming for Vengeance, goes platinum in the United States. May 29, 1983, US Festival 83 draws 600,000 fans for Judas Priest, Scorpions, Van Halen, and Ozzy Osbourne. I want to say like Devo played that too on Alternative Day or New Wave Day, you know, with the Ramones and Oingo Boingo and a bunch of other artists. November 26, 1983, Quiet Riot's Metal Health hits number 1 in Billboard. October 12, 1984, Def Leppard's Pyromania goes sextuple platinum in the United States. I'm reading from this just because, to me, this is the framing of heavy metal the commercial heavy metal in America, in the wake of, you know, this heavy metal soundtrack, this film, right? Like it's not going to obviously cover most of the bands that were on that soundtrack. But when it comes to the climate around this era of Black Sabbath, I think it's relevant to read Mr. Christie's words. He's a host of a show called Bloody Roots on satellite radio on Sirius Radio, if you can ever check it out. Highly recommend his book on Van Halen, which I'll be drawing from for the Van Halen episodes coming up. And I love the way he writes. And he seems like a nice dude. He answered a comment of mine on Facebook recently about Oingo Boingo and how I thought he really hated their guts after reading this book. And then I actually forced myself to go back and look for the quotes I was thinking of, and I only found 1, not the 2 that I thought he had mentioned. And it turns out he responded and said, "No, I love Danny Elfman, and I thought Oingo Boingo was really cool." He said, "You're probably just, you know, remembering some basic new wave hatred from what was on K-Rock at the time that I didn't like." And sure enough, that was basically what the quote was. So it says, no longer the exclusive domain of diehard devotees by 1983, heavy metal was airlifted into America and popularized through larger and more frequent concert tours. Fans whose idea of excitement was rearranged by AC/DC were completely swept off their feet by Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath, and other British invaders. Video would soon offer immense exposure, but the groundwork was established over years spent on the road cultivating a growing and immensely loyal audience base. Rare appearances by Iron Maiden and Judas Priest on the radio and covers of American rock magazines were nowhere near commensurate with their status in the hearts of headbangers. Some people buy songs, notes Iron Maiden manager Rod Smallwood. That'd be a different band altogether if Rod Smallwood was the singer and Bruce Dickinson was the manager. And some people buy bands. In April 1983, after years on the margins of the music industry, Judas Priest was awarded its first U.S. platinum album for Screaming for Vengeance. Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast and Peace of Mind also both went gold the same year. Positive signs indicated that Def Leppard's Pyromania would soon follow suit. The top British heavy metal bands were finally enjoying success on their own terms in America, the largest and most lucrative market in the world. For American teenagers, heavy metal became the soundtrack to a cultural revolution that included cable television and the first home computers and arcade video games. Also, cable television is, I guess, the only reason that the movie Heavy Metal kind of endured with views during the 80s, because I couldn't find much about there being a VHS release until the 1990s, the mid-90s. So, but people do talk about seeing it on like Cinemax at various hours, various days. So let's see. While Judas Priest sang of high-tech satellites in Electric Eye, fans were plugging into a new portable personal cassette player called the Sony Walkman, then blasting aliens in attention-addling electronic amusements like Vanguard, Robotron, Asteroids, Battlezone, and Defender, saving the universe one quarter at a time to a backdrop of high-energy music. A nation of adrenaline addicts found hope in the future. As the games later grew faster and more intricate, so would heavy metal. That's how you write! God damn it! You dorks at Melody Maker. Are you listening? I know you're not listening to me. You fucking douchebags. You made so much money and got so much free booze in the 70s and 80s just being assholes. God damn. And I know I've like praised people like Lester Bangs for being assholes to artists in previous episodes, but I like the way those guys write. They had some talent and they had some turns of phrase and they were good at describing things and making you feel something, even if they were shitting on an artist you liked. God damn. Ian Christie obviously doesn't write about stuff he hates. Apparently, I don't know. I'm sure he's got lots of stuff out there that I haven't checked out yet, but I don't know. I haven't read him being shitty about anything. I'm sure he's got bad reviews of metal bands out there, but anyways, God, it just makes me so mad. There's so many shitty rock critics that felt like gods out there taking down. You know, they were there to like take down the egos of these heavy metal artists that had no right to the money or the fame that they were wielding, I guess, was their attitude. Everyone should be listening to The Jam, apparently, and not Black Sabbath. That's so fucking weird. Let's see. The country was also demonstrating an appetite for adventure scenarios and alternate realities. So I think this ties in pretty well with the heavy metal movie. The popular Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game brought to life the quests of fantasy literature, like the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien, another son of Birmingham, England. In the layered escapist universe of D&D, players assume the roles of various social and ethnic beings like elves, warriors, magic users, and bardic musicians. The plots of the games generally involve killing monsters and collecting treasure while pursuing some greater heroic goal. Much of heavy metal took place on similar turf. A realm of dark towers and impenetrable wildernesses, wilderness, singular, I thought it was plural, populated by battles and adversity. You've got to write about heavy subjects. The metalers freak out over it, Dan Beeler of Exciter told Canada's The New Music television show. It's better than something like, I was walking down the street, you know. The medieval days were heavy. It was certain death for most people. That's what metal's all about. It's a fight. Here's what I'm leading up to. Black Sabbath rejoined the metal campaign with a formidable new frontman in Ronnie James Dio. He reverently refurbished and reinvented the band's stately doom with grandiose concepts. Staying with Sabbath for 2 studio albums, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, Dio found a fertile fantasy framework for the big Sabbath themes of madness and desolation. His Children of the Sea bemoaned environmental decline through the eyes of a dying ocean planet. Since his early 1970s band Elf, Dio had written quintessential fantasy lyrics. In Rainbow, those included Man on the Silver Mountain and the parable Stargazer, about a wizard who cripples civilization by attempting to build a stone tower to the stars. I grew up reading Sir Walter Scott and Arthurian tales, says Dio. Then I got really interested in science fiction, which also seemed to cloak characters in words and costumes that were very medieval. These were people, I realized, that were telling me the future. You read an Arthur Clarke book or Isaac Asimov, and when they told you something's going to happen in 10 years, they were right. They were just so brilliant, and they allowed me to use my imagination. When I became a songwriter, I thought, what better thing to do than what no one else is doing, to tell fantasy tales. Smartest thing I ever did. I know. Oh, what do I see? A few paragraphs down this same page. It's a little quote from Mr. Rob Halford that I think does a nice job of I don't know, rebuffing or rebutting the accusations of Mr. Dio about his lyrics. And this is just a coincidence because I opened the book and, you know, I found the Dio part. I didn't read ahead, and I just caught this little bit here. Talks about Judas Priest on Stained Class in 1978, where Savage, the song, chastised European colonists. You poisoned my tribe with civilized progress, baptizing our blood with disease. You christened our bodies with sadness and suffering, saying then that your God is well pleased. These finger-pointing history lessons were not typical rock topics, but audiences appeared to appreciate the forceful fables. And the quote from Rob is, I was never a tits and ass lyricist, says Rob Halford. I could never write the thong song, which gives you an idea of when this quote came from. Children, if you don't remember, the thong song came out around the year 2000 or 2001. You can go look that up if you like. But I could write Breaking the Law. At the end of the day, music is about having a fucking good time. But if you can put in something a bit more than that, it's just more satisfying. I'm not a guy with a message by any standards, but I like to feel that the things that I write about are important issues that not only affect me, but affect everybody else. So this Melody Maker, I guess, interview at their show is pre-Mob Rules, to correct myself, for any scholars and historians jump on me, because Vinny Appice is just filling in for Bill Ward, who is going through a real bad period of time right now where he's drinking 24 hours a day and not loving life, and he's out before the drums are recorded for Mob Rules, so this is pre that. I did get clarification on the E5150 song title, by the way. If you put the letter E in front of the Roman numeral for 5 and then 1 and then 50, it spells out evil. So V in Roman numerals is 5, I is 1, and L is 50, evidently. There we go. Hey, aren't you glad you know that now? Put that on your test, teachers, if you're needing some extra trivia to trip up the kids. Now, to just round out the last couple of quotes from that Melody Maker interview in 1981, the author, who is it? Paolo Hewitt says, I never expected heavy metal, Black Sabbath, or the old way of rock to be just as popular as it undoubtedly is. On Saturday afternoon, I heard Richard Strange on the radio talk about the death of rock, and then witnessed queues about a quarter of a mile long within Queen's Hall waiting to buy Sabbath badges, T-shirts, and all the merchandising they could get their hands on. They all stood there, herded about like cattle, shouting and shouting and chanting one name, Sabbath, 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 like it was a religion or something. In fact, it must be. Jesus Christ. Sabbath, to their credit, wrote it well. Down to earth guys, experienced enough to know how to handle success and all its implications. And if ever I questioned their old-fashioned motives and way of working, all they had to do was fall back on their past record. 4 nights sold out here, a couple million albums sold there. Of course, it didn't convince me. Sheena Easton can boast the same thing. And to be quite honest, I'd rather have been stuck in my hotel room with Dallas than Sabbath. But then, as Dio says himself, that's the way it is. And we'll end this part on the final Dio quote in the article. Who else can we think of that writes the way we write? Judas Priest were meant to be some kind of successor to a band like Sabbath, and they still write about let's go out at midnight, baby, and do whatever. It still boils down to the fact that they're talking about what their idea of heavy metal is, which is the more classic end of it. And that's not our end of it at all. I don't know what any of that means. They're still talking about love in some way, love between a man and a woman in whatever perverted way they speak about it. Well, Dio, actually, you could interpret Judas Priest lyrics, as being about a man and a woman if you're heterosexual. But turns out that's not the point of view they were being written from necessarily in every case. And thank goodness Rob Halford lived in a world that eventually allowed him to come out as gay in the late 80s, early 90s. And be comfortable with that. Jesus Christ, the guy is responsible for so much great shit in metal history. I mean, and then a lot of just shit in the 90s too, but whatever. Take it or leave it. The guy's a legend. And he created the whole look and the vibe of like leather and studs to generations of straight people who had no idea they were basically copying a leather daddy. Let's see. They're still talking about love in some way between a man and a woman in whatever perverted way they speak about it. I mean, this is what blows my mind of like talking shit about a band like Judas Priest that's flying the flag for heavy metal in, as the successor to the next wave. They were undoubtedly one of the 2 greatest bands of the wave of heavy metal that came after Sabbath and paid their respects all the time. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's some interviews from 1980 where Rob Halford and Judas Priest are talking trash about Black Sabbath for all I know. I don't get it. I don't understand why there's a shitty attitude. But maybe that's just Dio's shitty attitude. Not like Ozzy was all that nice in interviews when it came to his opinions about people during this time either. Let's see. We don't do that. We have our own piece to speak, and it's not what anybody else does. So I think we're absolutely original. All right, Ronnie. Good for you. But beyond, the milquetoast takes on, I think we're doing a fine thing, and we're A-okay. I think he's great at throwing barbs and throwing jabs when he's being interviewed by someone who's a little more clued into the heavy rock scene and the heavy metal scene, especially when tensions were high between, his camp and Ozzy's camp. The era, perhaps, when Ozzy was well known for having a little person on stage during his performances. He would physically, verbally abuse, that he named Ronnie to the crowd. That the crowd was aware of this actor's name was Ronnie, and he would. I think he would hang him from a noose at one point in some of the shows. I wasn't there, obviously. I was only 3.5, 4 years old, but if Sharon and company could, I don't know, put out some official remastered live video and audio from all these different eras of Ozzy's solo career, I'm pretty sure a lot of us would snap it up pretty fast. So let us jump now to a couple of quotes I want to read from the book The Decibel Diaries, A Journey Through Rock in 50 Concerts by Carter Allen or Alan Carter. Carter, Allen. I was going to say, not the guy from MTV in the early 80s, but that's Ellen Hunter I'm thinking of. Now, the author has written in this one chapter, chapter 28, Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne, about the Boston Garden concerts on March 4th, 1982, and April 2nd, 1982. This is before Sharon and Ozzy had the power to strong-arm promoters around the world and threaten them if they ever hosted a show featuring the members of Black Sabbath without Ozzy Osbourne, that they would never, ever, ever get an Ozzy Osbourne concert ever again. And in the business, I mean, it goes both ways. Promoters can be really, mean-spirited to the point that they can sort of tell artists, nope, you're not playing this theater anymore because I don't like what you did last time, or, you pissed me off, or for some political reason that somebody in your organization did something to someone in my organization, or you didn't bring enough people and we lost money last time. So you're not playing the arena. You can play the amphitheater on the outskirts of town that you won't be able to fill up maybe, but it's lower overhead for us, stuff like that. But still, it's pretty, it's pretty mean spirited. I mean, I could do hours if people would just send me all the worst stories about Sharon Osbourne and her business practices. I would read them gleefully for days and record them here. I would love it. I would love it, love it, love it. Not because I feel like, oh, I'm going to shame Sharon Osbourne. No, she's just one of those amazing characters in business and in the entertainment business. That's like, you just go, what? Like, they got away with what? I don't enjoy reading that stuff when it comes to like real estate moguls or, crappy presidents or politicians or oil barons. But when it comes to the history of rock and roll, when it comes to the history of television, when it comes to the history of vaudeville, stand-up comedy, film, I will eat this stuff up all day long, and I will choke it back out like a mama bird into your baby bird mouth as with great enthusiasm. And that's why I'm starting a Patreon feed, to have all the extra stuff that doesn't quite fit in with the standard, connection and correlation between a movie and an artist or a group of artists, or one artist in a couple of movies, because there's just too many fun stories that I want to read to you and I want to share. And that is going to be the basis of a lot of the Patreon stuff, as well as I'm planning to do some videos that would definitely get yanked off of YouTube for copyright infringement. So I'm tired of trying to do some fun stuff and then finding out too late that it's going to go against somebody's, rules when it comes to what the algorithm robots can find. Anyway, back to 1982, spring. The author talks about meeting Ronnie James Dio and, he's very short. He's 5'4". He, amazing that such a small man can have such a profound operatic level voice. He's considered one of the most powerful, expressive singers at hard rock. His manner in person was conversely soft-spoken and respectful, yet with a commanding presence. Two of his bandmates in the current version of Black Sabbath, original bassist Tony Geezer Butler and recently added drummer Vinny Appice, skulked about. I had to pause for a second just to verify my suspicion. Tony is not his name. His real name is evidently Terrence Michael Joseph Butler is his full given name. And there's some perfunctory blah, blah, blah about them, enjoying their juice and coffee and pastries from room service. He's sent there by Boston Rock Magazine to interview anyone in the band who wanted to talk. And impressively, he says, 3 showed up. My query was deliberately loaded, which means he's being a dick on purpose. You don't view Black Sabbath as over the hill? Dio, though, didn't take the bait. Finally, responding with a grin, everyone hates Sabbath, but the fans sell out shows all over the world. So you're going to be out on tour for forever, Appice shot back, cracking us all up. And now he does a little sort of retrospective for the reader of like, Sabbath, Sabbath came from here and they put out these albums and then blah, 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 heavy metal, and they built up a big following. The advent of punk eventually sidelined fans' attention, he says. At that point, after a career that literally defined heavy metal, with headline status at colossal rock festivals and a string of million-selling albums behind them, the members of Black Sabbath somersaulted into the showbiz purgatory reserved for those who had fought their way to the top, then squandered everything away. The death-defying, booze-fueled hijinks of lead singer Ozzy Osbourne outstripped that of the others, leading to a toxic madness that dashed any efforts to return the band to fighting form. I would like to remind you now, as your narrator, this is an entry in a book. So he's pulling from whatever the original interview was, but he's really padding it out with his retrospective take on things. I asked 3 members of Sabbath what happened. It must have been incredibly messy. As the designated veteran, Geezer took a break from his coffee roll to explain, "It came to a head over a period of years. We were in LA trying to start a new LP. Ozzy was supposed to be with us writing the record, you know. Then one day, he crawled in the door, brainless as usual, and remained that way for about a month. We said to him that we couldn't go on like this anymore. Go forth and multiply." Equally candid in his autobiography, I Am Ozzy, the singer wrote, "Firing me for being fucked up was hypocritical bullshit. We were all fucked up. If you're stoned and I'm stoned and you're telling me that I'm fired because I'm stoned, how can that fucking be? Because I'm slightly more stoned than you?" After the split, no one had given any odds for either party's survival, which is something I think is interesting to revisit in that timeline, that history. Like, nobody was like in the business, and there's maybe no young audience, coming out of high school or coming out of junior high. We're particularly thrilled or excited about, what are they going to do next? I mean, those last couple Black Sabbath albums, they've got some good songwriting in them. They got some good performances in them, but they're all over the place, man. And if you did like them, did you like the stuff that came before them? Because they sound a lot different. Myself, I'm happy for anyone who enjoys any Sabbath album because I love Sabbath so much. But I'm not equidistant in my affection. I like the stuff that moved me, and I kind of know why it did move me musically and lyrically, and that's all I'll say. Except for, I wish I could love every single thing they ever did. I think if I had to do the old, hey, Desert Island, you're trapped, you can only listen to one artist for the rest of your life, I'd probably listen to Black Sabbath because they have so many albums. And I know at least, 8 of them are going to be home runs. And there's going to be stuff on every album they put out that I'm going to like. In the 80s, man, Sabbath versus Ozzy and Roger Waters versus Pink Floyd. Is there any more bitter, rivalry, split relationship, former band member drama that can eclipse that, and bitterness and over the top efforts to, just do simultaneous arena tours and just be paranoid about what the other person's doing? Oh my God. Let's see. After the split, no one had given any odds for either party's survival, but here it was in 82, and both Black Sabbath and Ozzy were on tour and, in fact, headlining sold-out Boston Garden shows just over a month apart. Ozzy has been slagging Black Sabbath left and right recently, I continued. In Rolling Stone, he said, "You should all eat shit and die." Dio smiled. He'd heard that one before, I guessed. "I'm sure he has all sorts of great quotes. I wonder who's writing them for him," the singer replied. Whew! I like it. That's a good one. And then there's more writing I'll skip over for your benefit, and we'll bypass. Another good quote from Dio. "The band doesn't have the problem of a lead singer who can't sing anymore. I mean, he'd lose his voice after saying hello to the audience at the beginning of the show. The band was always doing their job, and Ozzy didn't much give a damn about anything. He just tried to generate publicity with his 'I'm the fool of the world' image, and he's done a good job of continuing that image as far as I'm concerned." Dio glanced over at the others with a grin. I could see that. I could absolutely see. The stuff I've been reading from this era, Dio he's given it 100%. He's like, I'm the guy in Black Sabbath. These guys didn't do anything wrong. They support me. I support them. They supported Ozzy, and Ozzy let them down. He is a team player to a point. Also, though, he's in a band with Tony Iommi, who's a leader. Dio's a leader. They both want to get their way. That's not going to happen. It's only a matter of time, and apparently the time was the mixing of the Live Evil record, where the two camps have to split up because they get suspicious of each other fucking around with the mix. Because, one group of guys is coming in early in the day, Another group of guys is coming in later in the day, and they're undoing each other's work when it comes to the mixing of the record, putting the vocals louder, then taking the vocals down, then making the guitars louder, taking the guitars down, according to them. Now, I believe archive.org is where I downloaded the History of Black Sabbath Volume 2, which you can't find many places on the internet anymore or buy very easily, I don't think. It's been a while since I checked, though, and that's the disc, the DVD that they put out in, I think, the late 90s, interviewing Geezer and Tony about, all the changes in the band post-Ozzy. And there's also a good Metal Mythos video by a guy named Razorfist, where he takes you through the whole history of Black Sabbath. He's very opinionated, biased against Ozzy, but also, he just doesn't like Ozzy. That's it. He doesn't dig that era. That's all. I'm not saying he's biased against Ozzy in particular, but I think he does a pretty good job of breaking down all the weird changes that happened in the 80s and 90s in Black Sabbath. And I want to dip into a bit from Steven Rosen's Black Sabbath book towards the end, where he mentions, the attempted reunion that Black Sabbath had with Ozzy in 1994 at one show in Costa Mesa, California. He calls it little more than an abortion gone bad. Prior to this gig in Costa Mesa, the band had been talking on a virtually daily basis for 8 months prior. This is while they're working with Dio. This is the Dehumanizer record era. It began as a 2-month tour, then an album, then an additional live album. And by the time conversations had ceased, they never once located themselves in the same room. Plans had them working together for an entire year. But Ozzy's side changed their minds, remembers Tony Iommi. They got too greedy. I think they wanted too much money, something in the range of $20 million. Because we enjoyed it when we all played together at that reunion show. That was Ozzy's final gig of that tour. It was the No More Tours tour in the early 90s. It was the, hey, I'm retiring. As we know now, Ozzy just, again, retired for the third time-ish, I think, stating he's just not going back out on the road, can't do it. That's how we broke up with Dio, because Dio wouldn't do this. He refused to go on stage, quote, with the clown, unquote, were his words. This was an offer for Black Sabbath to open for Ozzy Osbourne in Costa Mesa. So the Dio Sabbath would be an opening act for Ozzy, and then Sabbath goes on stage for the encore of Ozzy's set to play like 4 Black Sabbath songs, right? So Rob Halford called us, and we rehearsed today with Rob. He knew the old songs, and we went on and played a set with Bill, Geezer, Rob Halford, and Jeff Nichols, who's their keyboard player. And then, the second day of the show, we did a reunion with Ozzy. 4 numbers. It was great. That's when we really started talking about putting the band back together. But then, there were lies involved. Management. 4 different record companies, tour managements, 4 liars, and umpteen other things. It got silly. And even though we said yes, Osbourne's people didn't want to do it again. Ozzy wasn't ready to do it. The purpose of the thing was a nice idea. We could have earned a lot of money, and we could have had a great time if we could have just let it go at that. And then you start wanting this and that. It just got out of hand and fell apart. I feel sorry for Bill Ward, because he was doing a solo album at the time, and he just stopped the project altogether and put it on the shelf for 8 months. Bill concentrated on the Sabbath thing. That's all he thought about. Getting the drum risers built, finding people to build his kit. Yeah, because Bill wasn't in Black Sabbath during this time. And of course it was devastating when he heard it wasn't going to happen. So he had to pick up the pieces, and I just carried on and went to make an album. And now, Geezer's with Ozzy again. And after all the time saying he would never go back with Ozzy, he's with Ozzy. The way I look at it is that if some people can't work the way you want them, bring in someone else. There are times on the past albums where they'd be gone all day and leave me in the studio. They'd all be off in the fucking Bahamas somewhere, and I'd be there in London, in a dark studio, mixing the albums day and night. Sorry, I'm reading this. It's a footnote that takes up more than a third of the page. Steven Rosen just put this into the body of the goddamn page. Why is this so tiny? Good heavens. It's an asterisk that takes you down to a footnote, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, for crying out loud. This could have been its own 2-page thing. The original lineup got to the stage where we were never doing anything. They'd all go away on holidays when I was in the studio. It was a bloody nightmare. in a lot of cases, and the original lineup wasn't necessarily the most satisfying because there were always problems. There was always something going on, and those 8 months of trying to put the band back together showed it was no different. It still got problems and aggravation. Let's hear a little bit from the men themselves, Mr. Ronnie James Dio and Tony Iommi, speaking in 1994 about the failed Ozzy reunion in Costa Mesa.
And they announced that they were going to have a reunion. Well, that would have meant that it wouldn't be any band with me in it anyway, or Vinny, so I guess I did the right thing. And then not too long after that, Ozzy decided, no, I don't want to do this. So let's face it, it all comes down to the fact that someone wanted to break this band up, and they did a very good job of it.
Back in the old days with Ozzy, yes, we had some great times, but we also had a lot of problems, and, when it gets to a stage where you've got, certainly like now, where Ozzy's had his own band and Gee's had his and others mine, it's difficult when you all try and bring a unit back together that you once had, because you've all changed so much since then.
We were on a bus just like this. They stayed in the back, and I stayed in the front. Sorry, I didn't want to do that, but that's the way they chose to do it. So, next time, if you get a chance to talk to them, don't let them bullshit. Don't let them say, no, I don't want to talk about it. Ask them the real questions. Did you really talk about that? Well, the answer is no. And then play them that next time. So I can talk to you guys. You never talked about it, did you? And you blew the best band there ever could have been on the face of the earth, you stupid assholes.
Best band that ever could have been on the face of the earth. A band that had already released 3 studio albums and some live, and would eventually go on to reform as Heaven and Hell and release another studio album, I believe, full of full tracks, and a collection that had a couple of original tracks at the end of the collection. I've tried multiple times to watch their live performance, really high def DVD thing. Because I like the tunes, I like the playing, I do enjoy Ronnie doing his thing for the most part. And I realize that I just can't enjoy it with modern production styles. The vocals are super crisp and right up front. Everything's very defined and digital, and no, I can't get into it. I like the early 80s vibe. I can enjoy it sort of couched in that atmosphere, but not so much the modern, crisp, high def recordings of the original materials, live or in studio. And I have that issue with a lot of modern power metal kind of stuff too, or progressive kind of stuff. Anything with a singer that has obviously a Dio influence and the operatic style, describing actions taking place when warriors are fighting and things like that. And if it's really loud and bright and in your face, I can't take it too seriously. If it's too much emphasis on that delivery, I can't get away from it. And I don't want to be too dismissive of Dio's work and his talents. I really do actually like some of the stuff he did in Rainbow. And I think the same reason he's not gonna get along in a band with someone like Ritchie Blackmore is the reason why he's not going to get along in a band with someone like Tony Iommi. Both those guys have been through it with other bands that were huge and singers that were superstars, and they started their own, they started their own band, in Tony's case, his own version of Sabbath, so that they could be in control and minimize the amount of agency other people would have over their decisions, so they could get things done the way they want to do them. That's how it works. Sorry, Ronnie, you didn't get to come in there and get your way. I mean, I think his criticism of Sabbath and the way they operated was probably very justified. It sounds like there's a lot of bad stuff, a lot of baggage. People don't communicate well there. And you see that in the Rolling Stones too, around that same time. That's how these guys think business gets done. Don't be open, don't be honest, keep everyone guessing, talk through management, talk through lawyers. Don't be the kind of communicator that anyone can take advantage of, because they've been taken advantage of too many times by managers and lawyers. Now, there's a voice actor in the first speaking part for a character in heavy metal, and I almost didn't look him up. I was like, I don't want to go down another IMDb Wikipedia rabbit hole. I can't do that on like every single aspect of this. But I didn't listen to that voice, luckily, and I was richly rewarded for ignoring that voice, because the person I'm talking about is Don Franks, who is the gentleman that comes out of the Corvette and goes to bring the Lochnar quite ill-advisedly to his little daughter in the big house at the beginning of the film. And he has voiced a ton of characters and been a part of a ton of productions that I've seen growing up and well into even parts of adulthood. He, along with Frank Welker, are both the, I guess, best known voice actors for Dr. Claw of Inspector Gadget fame. Frank Welker also was, Megatron in the original Transformers. He was, I didn't know this until I looked it up, Nibbler in Futurama. Frank Welker's done 80 billion cartoon voices from definitely the 80s, 90s, and onwards. And that's what he's most known for. But Don, holy smokes. Okay, so he's not just a voice actor. He's an actor too. He's done, Broadway productions and live theater. He's done film. You can look up some of that stuff yourself. If you're curious about Finian's Rainbow, he was Woody Mahoney. But then heavy metal, he's Grimaldi, the astronaut in the beginning. I think that's his name. Then he's the co-pilot in B-17, and he's like one barbarian voice in the Taarna bit. He was in My Bloody Valentine, 1981. In Rock and Rule, he's the voice of Mock, the main villain. So that's going to, that's more of that's going to come up on the Rock and Rule episode, obviously. He was in Johnny Mnemonic in 1995. The character of Hooky. I don't remember. I haven't watched it since 1995. I don't think it holds up that well. But I think if anything, I'll probably watch it again someday just for the Ice-T and Henry Rollins performances. I think they were good. And speaking of Henry Rollins, he put out a movie in 2015 called He Never Died. Well, our boy Don Franks is in that too. He's portraying death in that and credited as the man with the goatee. So then we talk about some television stuff. He was in the Swamp Thing series in 1991, the voice of Anton Arcane. He was in the Police Academy TV series as a voice. He was, most importantly, the voice of Boba Fett in the Star Wars Holiday Special. So the first person you ever heard. No, that's not true. In the timeline of the creation of Boba Fett as a character, he would have been the first person people heard as the voice of Boba Fett. And while I didn't see that when it was new, I did see Star Wars Droids in 1985, the cartoon show that ran on Saturday mornings, and he was the voice of Boba Fett in one of those episodes. It was called like the White Witch or something like that. The White Witch was the name of a land speeder that's being raced. It was very, very cool. Damn it. He was a voice on the X-Men cartoon in the early 90s. Holy smokes. Sabretooth especially. And then he was in Goosebumps in one episode. He was the character of Walter in La Femme Nikita from 97 to 2001. He was the ill-fated Silver Surfer cartoon that nobody saw. He was K-Lock. Then he did some video game stuff, a lot of X-Men, because he was the voice of Sabretooth. That was the most, recognizable, at least during that time. But, I mean, this guy's done everything. And there's a lot more to this. He's a musician as well. He has, plenty of recordings to his name when it comes to stuff he's done for soundtracks or maybe his own performances. He was Archie Goodwin in the 1982 Nero Wolfe Canadian radio series, which I think is pretty awesome because I love the Nero Wolfe radio shows. I haven't heard this production though. And then to round it all off, he was Skunk, the character of Skunk. He performed that voice in the Gene Simmons animated TV show My Dad the Rockstar from I think 2003. Yes, that was a thing that happened, and I've not seen it, so I might have to put myself through that for a future Kiss episode. We'll see. Now, some notes on the Lochnar. There were, that was voiced by not a very well-known actor, but I want to give him credit, Mr. Percy Rodriguez, who I believe they said came from South America, where he was best known for some of his acting work and voice acting work until then. Anyhow, they had issues with the writers of the different segments trying to stay consistent with what the Lochnar could do. Like they kind of had to keep having conversations about it. It was inspired by a Mickey Spillane story called Kiss Me Deadly, which of course was made into a film and then used as the title of a very famous Lita Ford song. And it seems like it must have also influenced Pulp Fiction. And it's, it's this glowing thing that just ruins everyone's life, but everyone's looking for it. It's people are seeking it out, and it just destroys the folks who come across it. Not unlike the car in the Repo Man as well, I want to say. And I've been revisiting my notes on Repo Man recently, and I might, I don't know when I'm going to get that one done, but I think that might be Patreon only, and it might be fairly simple. I want to say fairly simple, but I got a lot of information about Black Flag and about the Circle Jerks and, other bands of that era that I want to get into, and I don't know how else I'll be able to do it if I don't attach it to Repo Man. Now, originally the movie was supposed to have a October or November release that year, but it got pushed up to August very, very suddenly. Reitman got it sold to Columbia, and that decision, was supposed to be like more beneficial to Columbia when it came to the box office. They had, from what they knew or what they were forecasting and what else they were releasing that year, it would have made them a lot more money to release it in August than to wait until it was actually done. So overnight, everyone's workload got increased and the timeline got shortened. Animators would animate, in some of these studios from like 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Heavy Metal, work from 10 to 5 on their like commercials, or in some cases, one studio was doing cartoons for Sesame Street, and that's what they were doing to pay the bills. And then at 5 p.m., they get back to work on Heavy Metal until 10 p.m. Some of the things that happened, So Beautiful, So Dangerous, that the segment with the, robot having sex with the lady, albeit off camera, and the two space stoners driving the ship, doing all the white powder on the floor and sucking it up into their noses and then crashing. That whole thing, I've actually read through it, thanks to archive.org, I believe it was, that I found it on. Oh no, I'm sorry, I take it back. It was someone else's blog page. They'd sort of reviewed it page by page. And it's like a 65-page long story that they chopped way the hell down. Also notably, the end of the movie when the house explodes, it's not animated. It's just a model of a house that they blew up because they were using that as a rotoscope or a traceover model. And they just didn't have time to animate the sequence, so they just gave it like a green screeny kind of filter effect, I think, and blasted it to smithereens before the final scene of the film. Another element that led to a lot of inconsistency visually is the fact that, they had to go out recruiting for more animators in some cases for these studios. They just didn't have the staff to crank this out in time. So they would go find, young students at art schools and stuff and hire them on for, I'm sure, what were dirt wages at the time. But you see that lead to sort of some inconsistency when it comes to body proportions of the characters at times. Couple things about the Captain Stern segment that I haven't touched on yet. The crew up in Montreal, was a studio that was most used to doing these kind of, framing of one or two characters per panel. Not a lot of sweeping landscapes like you see in something like Taarna, or like you would see in other segments, like Den. Even, I mean, Den's pretty primitive compared to Taarna when you look at it, but it was its own style at least. And this Captain Stern's a little more like, two characters per shot, framed up in a pretty simple way. Even though there's some chasing going on towards the end, there's some running through the space station to sort of open things up a bit to your eyes. Interestingly, there's this floating eye robot that's following different characters around depending on what's happening in the courtroom and during the trial. It changes size depending on what character it's next to. And this is the part of the movie that has this Cheap Trick song. Carl Macek in the commentary mentions that the visuals that they had gotten together of this whole middle section of the chase where Captain Stern has to Hanover Fist ends up having to deal with some security robots that are in his way while he's chasing after Stern. they were removed, I would assume mostly for time, but they also just decided they wanted to let the song play through that part and not cut it down for dialogue. They didn't want to like bring the music score soundtrack part down, which is a bummer because the scene featured recorded voiceover acting from Doug Kenny of National Lampoon and Caddyshack fame. And if you don't know the story, if you haven't heard me bother you enough about checking out the story of National Lampoon, I highly recommend you you go find a streaming source for A Stupid and Futile Gesture and Drunk, Stoned, Brilliant, Dead. The first is a dramatization of the story of the creators of National Lampoon, and the second being the regular documentary. They're both worth it, I promise you. Doug Kenny was a very talented guy, very also depressed, and he was an addict, and he died in Hawaii a couple years, I think, after Caddyshack came out. He was the creator of that story. He was very upset at how it was changed, and he hated the stupid gopher puppet. He was miserable after the movie came out, and the prevailing joke among his friends, supposedly at his funeral or after his funeral was, because he had walked out past an area on this cliff in Hawaii where there was a posted sign saying, "Do not pass this sign," I guess. And, obviously he did, ended up falling to his death. And the joke was, when they discussed, do you think he meant to commit suicide, or was he just wasted and fell? Feeling among his friends was, knowing Doug Kenny, he didn't intentionally jump from that perch to kill himself. He was simply clambering down to another area of the cliff to find a better place to jump and accidentally fell. So that he died accidentally searching for a much better place to kill himself from. If you heard the episode I did about badass outlaw journalists and writers from the late 60s in the counterculture recently, I read some stuff about Michael O'Donoghue. I would recommend watching A Stupid and Futile Gesture, the dramatization, just so you can watch Tom Lennon, formerly of The State, Reno 911 as Lieutenant Dangle, and a million other wonderful things that have made us laugh over the years, portraying Michael O'Donoghue. Now, since I went extra on Dio, god damn it, they're everywhere. I went extra on Dio. Oh boy, I decided. Jesus Christ! God damn it! Okay, maybe that's the worst of it for now. I'll just hide over here for a little bit. Let's see if I can get some more narration done. I think it's only fair to cover Devo a bit more after Dio. I went long, of course, because I just know more stuff about Black Sabbath. I think I've read 5 books about Black Sabbath, and I could easily read 5 more. I think I've read 5 books about the Ramones. I could easily read 5 more. There's just something about those two bands that never, ever gets old. And there's so much backbiting and infighting and outfighting and all kinds of stuff going on throughout the history of their business practices and their, I don't know, man, their interpersonal relations, that there's always another point of view to tell the same stories from, or another point of view for a different version of the events that happened at the same time. However, Devo, not Dio. Devo is the only band that appears, albeit in animated form, in the movie, even though it's not them. It's a bunch of aliens performing as the audio of Devo doing work in a coal mine, I figure I owe it to myself to take advantage of more of the story resources that I can find about the band's history. I have to say that much like Cheap Trick, everything I can find about Devo and the heavy metal soundtrack is just limited to a couple of sentences. It's just like, and then they did this, moving on. If it wasn't there, that's how it is, I think, with a lot of band histories. If it wasn't their release that they had control over, there's not a lot of story to be told, or, not a lot of demand for the story to be told. But this is, early MTV era Devo. And they were already pretty well experienced in, creating and editing their own film projects that go along with the music that they were doing. The whole presentation of what de-evolution was all about, right? So when it came to MTV, they were really hoping that, they would have a strong part in what's going on monetarily, because they're, sort of a one-stop shop for all their own video content, right? MTV at this point wasn't even nationwide when they started working, when Devo started working on their own videos for MTV. There was a lot of different cable, whatever you'd call them, providers regionally that weren't convinced that it was going to be anything more than a quick fad, and not the kind of thing they could actually bank on offering in a standard lineup of cable channels in the early 1980s yet. Eventually, as we know, they would become the dominating force in the music industry, and record companies would start having a lot more influence over what happens in videos. Not so with Devo, obviously. And if you don't know what I mean, go back and just search for Devo videos online, and there are collections that they put out on VHS in the 80s. All the interesting, super wild, short film stuff they did, linking the songs together. I can't begin to explain it. It's too great. It's too weird. It's too fun. But you'd have to have a radically mature attention span as a young person today, I think, to see it and sit through the whole thing from beginning to end. I don't think it works on that level so much anymore, except for a select few out there in the potential audience. Let's see. Devo has always believed in imagery with ideas and integrity, Jerry of the band said in 1984. We think of the syncing of visuals to music as probably the most important artistic phenomenon of this century, and we respect that medium. Most rock videos, though, don't seem to respect the medium. There's just too much of what I call puzzling evidence that all this ridiculous indulgence in gratuitous, meaningless imagery has no integrity at all. It's mystifying. It doesn't mean anything, and it has no connection to the song. They hire these rock video directors as creative mercenaries to apply a fashionable visual aesthetic to the band. After a while, it gets so dumb and pretentious. Watching MTV for an hour is like watching Chimps on Parade, or at best, record label baby pictures. Damn, that's a good one. Good one, Jerry. Record label baby pictures. File that away somewhere. It's a cheap, shallow approach that insults the intelligence of the audience. It's no different, really, than putting a pretty girl in a bikini on top of a station wagon so you can sell a lemon, For anyone not American and that didn't grow up in the 70s and 80s, a lemon is just a slang term for a really crappy car that's going to break down on you after you drive it off the lot. Now, in the book, Are We Not Men? We Are Devo, chapter 32 mentions heavy metal for about, one paragraph. Or enough, one sentence and one paragraph. Chapter 32, 4 albums in 3 years. It's no wonder Devo chose a Weary Workers song for their next exquisitely mutated cover. In September 1981, simultaneous with the release of New Traditionalists, the band contributed Alan Toussaint's Workin' in a Coal Mine to the soundtrack for Heavy Metal, an animated rock film. That's as far as they go into the movie. It's an animated rock film. The song wasn't on New Traditionalists, but would soon be included in the package as a bonus single. Working in a Coal Mine had been a hit for Lee Dorsey in the mid-'60s. So they're clearing up my speculation from earlier in the episode where I was like, isn't that some swing era thing? But once again, Devo aptly sidestepped soul and added machinery, which is the trick, right? That's their whole thing. Take everything cool and sensual and, sexy out of the songs that they cover, and make it herky jerky, make it uncomfortable, unless you're super into Devo and you can and will dance to it. Damn it. Let's see. The synthesized beat is accented by a spiky clang at the top of each measure. Bob 1's, because there's two Bobs, twangy guitar, setting the whimsical foundation for the hiccupy lead vocals and the throaty declaration. Lord, I am so tired. How long can this go on? Which does appear in the Lee Dorsey version as well. Now that I've listened to it, it's interesting to me to kind of reflect on how Devo just really took a song with the arranged parts and instruments as they were and just sort of one by one replaced them with their own methods of recreating a similar layer of instruments. Like they're not adding lots of extra tracks. That's what's curious to me about Devo and interesting about this. They're primitive. They're digital, but they're primitive. I mean, they're recording on analog, but they're playing electronic instruments, but they're not taking advantage of technology in a way that allows them to create mixes or layers in a way that they can't pull off as just 4 or 5 people live, right? With the instruments in their hands. And if you listen to the Lee Dorsey version and then their version, you don't hear a huge disparity in the types of arrangement and the mixing and the placement of instruments and what they each bring to the overall sound of the song. Back to the text, it says, the choice of the song and its handling are as effective as Satisfaction and Secret Agent Man, because they had done those two previously. In this case, the band's blue-collar/intellectual dichotomy plays both with and against Toussaint's original idea. The Spuds, the dirty hard workers of the earth, really do seem tired. But there's also an ambiguity to the playful, catchy delivery. Sincerity was always too simple a notion for Devo, and the aesthetic tension in their treatment of the old chestnut was true Devo. With working in a coal mine in their canon, it was evident that for all their originality, and because of their originality, Devo was one of the best cover bands of the era. The 4-month New Traditionalists tour, which began in mid-October, covered the United States and Australia. By now, the electronic delivery of the music had become the trademark of a band previously known for its raw, shadowy punk energy. Devo was one of the few rock bands willing to admit that disco had added new artistic possibilities to music and had embraced some of the technical contributions of the genre, especially the use of the drum machines. The sound on New Traditionalists is heavily reliant on the use of the Linn, Linn, drum machine. There's a brief scene in the Beautiful World video where Alan is playing what appears to be an Oberheim D8 drum machine by hand. Devo was also getting deeper into experimenting with new technology on stage. They had, even in the early years, been one of the first bands to embrace wireless guitar transmitters, treating the computers and sequencers not as gadgets, but as tools to advance their vision. Now, this next bit relates back to, earlier in the episode we were talking about their move out to California, right? And this is sort of far enough along after that move that the effects of that are setting in. Positive, negative effects, evidently. Partly because of the increased use of synthesized drums, Alan Myers was feeling alienated. To me, things kind of got cut off from their root when we came out here to California, he said. It was all kind of a blur to me at that point because creatively, it wasn't really hitting the core anymore. Artistically, what happened with the group pretty much after we got out here didn't resonate to me. It lost its life energy. When I first started playing with the group, the material that we wrote for the first couple of albums, we'd get together, and there would be a lot of information, a lot to play with. But once we came out here, it was like there was somehow never anything, any joy, any happiness of like having any goop to play with. It was always like, wow, what's going on here? There's no texture here. It's almost like you can compare to the ground in Los Angeles and the ground in Ohio. There you've got earth, you've got grass, you've got something you can stick your hand in and play with. And out here it's dry and you need a hammer to make a dent in it. And I almost felt like creatively that was when it was like it was like trying to take something and grow it in this barren ground. We forced ourselves to create freedom of choice. We sat in this little room and we just hammered out that record as a matter of survival. That was an act of will, that record. And then after that, things just creatively became more and more parched. Yeah, check this out. I found a great story from back in 1975, it looks like, about a Halloween party that Devo played at, or tried to play at. Now, this involves Sun Ra. And if you're like me, you like a bit of jazz. You like the horns and the pianos and the stand-up basses and the drumming and the interesting stuff, even the bop or the wilder stuff from the 50s. But this guy, it's out there, man. Okay, let's just say you got to be into some outside kind of approaches to music to get into Sun Ra. I say that as someone that's never gotten into Sun Ra. Hopefully there may be maybe there's hope for me someday, but I haven't tried that hard. So I'm going to read a lot straight from the text of this Are We Not Men, We Are Devo book, because it just tells the story so well. And I don't have enough knowledge of Devo in the 70s. I don't have enough knowledge of Devo in general, let alone in the 70s, to expand on this at all. So, Sun Ra, although a nationally significant figure, fell outside the WHK. Oh, sorry. There's a concert that's a private Halloween party for Cleveland's radio station WMMS-FM. He fell outside the station's heavy rotation of Rolling Stones, Bad Company, and Lynyrd Skynyrd. And Devo, well, it's pretty certain none of the station's employees had even heard of them. Probably someone had suggested that the Akron band might be good for a Halloween joke without really explaining the punchline. Sun Ra was in residence at Cleveland's Smiling Dog Saloon from October 28 to November 9. Ed Barger worked there, so it's possible he had something to do with Devo being booked. I assume Ed is a friend of the band or something. However, it came to pass, though, the night proved to be a defining moment in Devo's ability to use music as a weapon of mass destruction. The WHK Auditorium dated to the 1930s, when it was built as a radio broadcast theater. Located off a stretch of Euclid Avenue between downtown and some of the city's worst neighborhoods, the HK was a perfect symbol of a collapsing industrial giant. Once lovely and ornate, it had fallen into decadence. Rock and rollers were gathering together, the detritus of someone else's dream. Tuxedoed men and fashionable ladies had once enunciated into chromed microphones there. And now, Devo had arrived to set up their gear. Various members of the WMMS staff were milling about with their friends, dipping into a vat of tequila sunrise and inhaling nitrous oxide. WMMS was known as Home of the Buzzard, taking the nickname from an annual event in nearby Hinckley, where once a year, turkey vultures came home to roost in Ohio's version of the San Juan Capistrano Swallows. That's some symbolism right there for your town. Oh, my goodness. The station's logo, ubiquitous on T-shirts and bumper stickers, featured a cartoon buzzard and had become a symbol of everything Devo thought was wrong about rock and roll. Mindless mass consumption of music programmed by clueless suits. Hey, we've got even more of that these days. Hooray. Thanks, Clear Channel. Let's see. The station's... sorry, lost my place. Started thinking about the great deregulation in the early 2000s of the communications industry. the era of the old AOL Time Warner merger. There was a intensely blue collar image to WMMS. Leo Travagliante, known by the handle Kid Leo, closed each afternoon drive time shift by announcing it was time to wash up and punch out. Kid Leo would soon gain significant industry cred by championing a young New Jersey singer-songwriter named Bruce Springsteen. WMMS and Springsteen were made for each other. All denim and leather, no-nonsense, working-class rock. Widely credited as a key figure in breaking Springsteen, Kid Leo would eventually become a Columbia Records vice president. That's interesting. Columbia Records is, I think, what Did they put out? They might have put out the heavy metal soundtrack. I gotta check. They put out the Columbia Pictures put out the movie. Maybe that's what I'm getting mistaken. Nope, looked it up. I was wrong. Label is from 1981 version before it was re-released by Rhino Records many years later. It was Full Moon / Asylum / Epic Records put out the soundtrack. Okay. See, I'm trying to find connections where there are no connections. That's what the human brain does. What are you going to do? Also, Kid Leo, before he left the station, let's see. Oh, his incessant claim that Cleveland was the rock and roll capital of the world would help land the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum on the shores of Lake Erie. Back in 1975, though, Kid Leo was mostly concerned with celebrating at the Big Halloween Bash. Although the WHK Auditorium sat 1,500 people, the crowd was relatively small, with select invited guests from Cleveland's rock elite. Murray Saul, one of the station's best-known personalities, was tapped to be the master of ceremonies. Saul was known as the Get Down Man for his trademark bellowing of the catchphrase, gotta get down. I don't know if that's how he said it. That's how I've decided he said it. Devo was dressed that night in the same blue Dickies work suits and clear masks they had worn at the Creative Arts Festival. Mark wore the baby mask. Once again, they were billed under their characters' names. Mark was Bougie Boy. Jerry was the Chinaman. Bob Mothersbaugh was the Clown, and his brother Jim was Jungle Jim. Their appearance didn't raise a lot of eyebrows at first. Who knew they always dressed like this? It was Halloween, and everyone was wearing a costume, although most had opted for the traditional witches, gangsters, and hunchbacks. Devo set up its gear, complete with the Halloween-ish electronic drum set, and Jerry called for Murray Saul to say a few words into the microphone, with the high-pitched Bougie Boy piping in, "Murray! Murray!" Saul ambled onto the stage, started spewing his husky, stoned, hipster radio spiel, stumbling through a thick-tongued commentary on Cleveland's new marijuana law. Such the easy life. It is what it is. And it is such the such, he said, making virtually no sense. He turned to the members of Devo, wishing them a happy Halloween. "Good evening," Saul continued. "I thought you would at least come in at least real clothes instead of such outrageous costumes." "Tell it like it is, Murray," Bougie Boy warbled. I don't know if that's how he talks. I just watched a clip of some footage from the video release they had called like The Men Who Make the Music, and it was really interesting to see Bougie Boy doing his Bougie Boy thing and other characters that they have in masks doing their thing. I won't try to explain it for you. I can't put it in context. It's a hoot, though. But it's easy to find some of this footage to watch, it seems like. So check it out if you haven't. So Bougie Boy tells him to do it, to tell it like it is, Murray, and Saul says, "That's right. You got the concept." "He tells it like it is," the innocent Bougie pointed out to the crowd. Saul rambled on about the long-neglected auditorium and then broke suddenly into an almost belching, we have been going crazy, going nuts, because it's Friday! Friday! Unintelligible, in parentheses. Yowza, howza, wada hoda hoda. Then after a couple more he's-ahs and yowzas, he explained that this will be a crazy party, and we're going to do it because we gotta, followed by 10 more slurred gottas. Get down! And finally, the introduction. "Oh, we gotta go low with Devo, what it is." And then Saul stumbled off as Jim started plunking out a staccato rhythm on the drums, Mark following with a series of grating, repetitive, mechanical screeches from his synthesizer. Once his musical hair shirt was sufficiently spread out, Jerry, in what was now a fully mutated version of his backwater blues, began howling, "My woman's subhuman!" It began to dawn on the audience that if this was a joke, it wasn't funny. And if it wasn't a joke, it had to end immediately. Drunken ghouls and witches began shouting at Devo. A beer can flew toward the stage. Then another. Then another. The band's response was obvious. They didn't like it? Then we'll just give them more. They soldiered on, inspired by the confrontation. They played Bamboo Bimbo, an equally tortured and torturous blues variation. When it ended, there was an almost inaudible smattering of applause. Devo had some friends in the audience, which is probably the only reason they weren't killed that night. Marty Raymond had come with his brother, a tough, brawling Vietnam veteran, and some other guys from Akron's working-class Firestone Park neighborhood, guys who liked a good fight. They became de facto bodyguards for this bunch of skinny performance artists who seemed intent on ruining someone else's party. We're Devo, D-E-V-O, and we'll prove it right now, Jerry spat out. While a few members of the audience remained, perhaps hoping to kick some ass, the room was nearly evacuated. You guys just can't take it, Jerry said. It was brutal. One of the band members took a bullwhip from a Halloween dominatrix and began cracking it at her, ordering her to submit. This had worked for Dr. Moreau, but it was having the opposite effect on the drunken audience. Late in the set, oh my God, they got to play that long, did they? The band debuted what would become its defining anthem, Chaco Homo. The song went on and on and on, with the group repeating the call and response, "Are we not men? We are Devo." Someone grabbed the microphone and screamed, "You're a bunch of assholes," prompting Jerry to begin taunting in a cracked voice. "Is he not a man? Is he not a man? He is Devo. He is Devo." Finally driving the offending figure from the room, with the band continuing to taunt as he left the building. Jocko Homo went on for 6 minutes, but seemed like 3 times that long. As it ended, Mark's synthesizer emitted a wash of noise and over as Devo played "I Need a Chick" during the final nails, before the whole mess fell apart in white noise and confusion. "Why don't you get out of here?" someone yelled as the sound began to fade. "I'm telling you to get out of here." The battlefield was littered with beer cans and other debris. It wasn't clear who had won. Certainly not Sun Ra, who made his entrance to a nearly empty auditorium as he opened his set with 25 years to the 21st century. The only people there to see him were Devo and their handful of friends. Now, this next chunk should bring to mind, maybe if you're of a certain age, one particular South Park episode or just the various pop culture references to what has come to be known as the brown note. This was as close as Devo would come to fulfilling one of its fantasies. Jerry, in his days with the SDS, who we talked about a couple of episodes ago on my Valentine's Day episode, had heard about subsonic frequency generators, which were capable of producing a noise outside the normal audible frequency and to cause people to lose control of their body functions. I asked myself, what are the creative uses of those? Jerry once said. He and Mark often repeated their description of the ultimate Devo concert. We'd like to hand out diapers at the door to a concert of 10,000 people. And then for the finale, we'd turn on the subsonic frequency generators and cause spontaneous bowel movements. They once explained in a joint interview, and rather than being uptight about it, they would love it. Like, that's what they came for. And they would be mad if they left without it. Rather than lighting matches for the Eagles, one mass infantile pre-sexual eruption, all tense muscles getting lax. In their descriptions of this hypothetical perfect concert, Mark and Jerry envisioned these performances taking place all over the globe, with Devo controlling the music and, by virtue of subsonics, the audience from afar. This carried another echo from Kraftwerk, who talked about having robots perform concerts around the globe simultaneously, as the members ran the show from their Dusseldorf studio. If Devo hadn't succeeded in making the members of the WMMS Halloween audience shit themselves, they had used a wall of sound to drive them away, like the Pied Piper in reverse. This may not seem like a significant accomplishment, but it did serve to cement a piece of Devo theory. It was open season on pinheads. The reaction of the audience to Devo's mind simply proved that the great masses were clueless spuds. The night passed with the 4 members of Devo and their few friends being treated to a private audience with Sun Ra. The same night, not far away, another equally confrontational local band made its debut. They were called Frankenstein, playing at a Cleveland bar called the Piccadilly Penthouse. The singer, Stiv Bators, got into a fight during the band's set, and Frankenstein broke up immediately. They would reform that winter and take a new name, the Dead Boys. I just found a YouTube link to the audio recording of the whole Halloween show. I'm going to include it in the description for you to check out on your own. It's amazing. Heavy Metal's a movie that I'm glad we have. I'm glad it was preserved, even though it didn't do well at the box office. I'm glad it was recirculated in the mid-1990s on home video, and at least it did, that did well enough to prompt a sequel, Heavy Metal 2000, or FAKK, or FAKK 2, that I guess was a big project for Kevin Eastman, co-creator of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, who was at that time in charge of Heavy Metal magazine, to cast his wife or girlfriend at the time. I don't know. I don't remember anymore. I think it was his wife at the time, Julie Strain, to be the protagonist and the model for the animation. And it didn't do too well. It totally abandoned the anthology structure of the original and of the comic books. It just told one story instead of telling multiple stories and taking it off to multiple vistas. It was just, another animated sci-fi fantasy with lots of action and stuff, I guess. I never sat through it. It's not like it's all that easy for me to find. It's not. I suppose I could search a little more intently than I have, but I don't know. I haven't read anything great about it. But I sure was excited when its soundtrack came out. And I have to say, for what it's worth, if you trust my opinion on anything musical, it's got one of my favorite all-time greatest songs by one of my all-time favorite bands, Monster Magnet. And especially post Power Trip, post Dopes to Infinity, for me, they're kind of up and down, hit and miss. But this one, Silver Future, just knocks it right out of the park. And there was a really cool, really heavy Pantera song on it. I think it was Immortally Insane. Cool stuff. I dug it. I think I listened to the Billy Idol track once. That's all I remember at the time of it coming out. Luckily, I had a girlfriend with a computer and a good internet connection at the time. So, I was off to LimeWire, I believe it was. Oh, it was Kazaa, the file trading platform Kazaa, to download various inferior audio quality versions of those two songs that I enjoyed a lot. But Monster Magnet did put Silver Future as a bonus track on God Says No, which is a good album. And then I think Pantera released Immortally Insane on some collection that came out much later or something. I think it might be on the expanded and remastered Terry Date mix of Reinventing the Steel right now, as a matter of fact. By the way, did I even clarify that that metaphor I made much earlier in the episode about Russo and Dan O'Bannon being the Garfunkel and Oates of their particular movie working relationships? I was trying to say Russo is like John Oates to George Romero's Daryl Hall, and that Dan O'Bannon was the Garfunkel to John Carpenter's Paul Simon. Hopefully that made a little bit more sense. Some of you might have understood where I was going with it and just thought, okay, whatever, Jay, get on with it. I don't blame you. But what I do blame you for is not checking out the links in the description that will take you to the new A History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll Patreon page. Now, at the encouragement of someone who wrote in last month, I have taken it upon myself to try to think of a way that a Patreon would actually be worth some money to somebody who listens to this show. And, what does a Patreon usually give you that you can't get from the main feed? Well, podcasts that I enjoy. Sometimes it's just early access, which is not enough for me to pay for. But sometimes it's expanded content or unedited content that's longer. Sometimes it's video content you can't get, obviously, by listening to a podcast. Sometimes it's just double the content because the person I'm following on Patreon is a comedian and they talk about current events. And that fuels some of the observations they have that are very funny to me, and I don't want to miss out on those. Sometimes it's just, I guess, I mean, I don't have anyone that I follow that does this, but I assume there's a lot of them that are just naughtier content that they can't put out there in the normal channels, right? Well, I've decided I want to take advantage of the Patreon model to avoid despair at not getting paid for this after all this time, not having any ads yet, or being attracting any ads, or being qualified enough to get the ads, I guess, according to the platform that I'm on. And I don't mind not having to wrestle with the morality of that anyways, and, pretend that I like a certain product if I don't care about it. So I would also like to do more for people that really do appreciate this stuff. If you could stand to listen to more content than what I do every month, I think this will be nice for you. I'm going to take a lot of stuff that I haven't put into podcasts because they didn't quite fit the mold or the narrative that I needed to frame some subject in, but that I have earmarked. I mean, in some cases, like 3 years ago when I started collecting research for these ideas, putting bookmarks in books and buying other books, going to the library, taking photos of pages of books that I didn't really need the whole thing, clippings from websites and blogs and old issues of magazines and things that are doing nothing. So I can go on the Patreon. I can say, this is a really cool story I found. It doesn't relate to any movie or any artist that I can cover for a whole episode. Let's talk about it now. Here's a chapter out of a book that I love that relates to rock history in some way, or something tangential maybe to the podcast in some way. And I just love the way it's written. I'm going to read it to you. You're just going to get some audiobook narration for the next hour. Something like that. And then all this video footage I have downloaded of old MTV stuff that, I've tried once to do watch-alongs and reactions to on YouTube, and it gets flagged, and I try to edit it, and it gets flagged again. It's just impossible working with YouTube's copyright algorithm protectors, and it's so different from artist to artist. So, this would be a way I can provide video content to you, and it'll be, for the time being, I've decided just to do $3 a month. So you'll get at least 3 hours of some kind of extra rock history oriented content during a month's time. And if you want to wait a while and pull the trigger later and not jump on it now, I understand. If you want to wait for a few months worth of content to build up that you can just all download at once and then jump off and then see if you like it, I mean, that's kind of what I would do. That's and another thing reason I didn't do the Patreon before this is, well, I don't know. A lot of podcasts have Patreons so that they can charge you for material they've already released years ago and put behind a paywall. And I don't have that, obviously. I don't want to take things down. And so what this means for the future is I will be focusing the normal monthly feed on things that I've still wanted to do. I've had a list that's always growing of different episodes and ideas for them. But I'm going to focus more on the ones that will probably be liable to attract people searching for the names of those movies or the names of those artists. That's, the numbers show me that people are really interested in finding this podcast because they're interested in Guns N' Roses. They're interested in Chris Cornell, Janis Joplin, The Doors. Not so much the Blasters, not so much Hank Williams so far, unfortunately. I loved making those episodes, but I think for that reason, my third and final Hank Williams episode is just going to be behind the Patreon wall for the folks that really, that have listened to the previous two already, and are obviously interested in the podcast in general enough to check it out on that side of things. So, I'm planning to do some readings and some historical background on early rock and roll, the 50s. We're going to talk from the point of view of how a guy like Ed Ward covers history of rock and roll compared to how a guy like Nick Tosches covers the history of rock and roll. I'm going to pull a lot of wacky stuff out of my piles of papers and magazines and books and discuss those. Not sure what the first video project's going to be. I've got the rest of March to sort of figure it out, but I think it'll be maybe a little half hour to an hour test of some MTV footage, see how it goes. And I hope you join me. I hope you'll dig it. I hope you'll find it worth your time and money. I hope you know that you absolutely deserve to be happy. I hope you know that you deserve to be loved. I hope you know that you deserve to be able to put your time into things that make your life better. Rock and roll is the greatest. And so are you. And for those of you that fall asleep listening to long podcasts, here comes the rest of those Atari noises that I recorded the other day to mess up your dreams.